What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was taken by the aliens Jiraiya bashing Team 7 bashing? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. It was times like these that Kuroda Rei hated herself. Times like these, as in sitting up in a dark, unknown alley with her hands pressed to her head to ward off a splitting headache. Dark eyes squeezed shut in pain. Pretty much expected, seeing how she probably had a nice dent in the back of her head from crashing into the wall in front of her and getting knocked out. Fortunately there was no blood, even as she continuously checked, raking her fingers through her short, dark hair. Unfortunately, she had no idea where she was. Rei groaned and stood, hand on a nearby dumpster for support. What would her dad say about this? She knew it by heart. Buy you books, send you to school, and what do? Fall through a hole in the wall. A blue hole in the wall. Rei muttered out loud, glaring up at a blue sky above her. The same shade of blue that hole had been. In retrospect, it really hadn't been her fault. Really. Curiosity was a natural human reaction to a hole in the wall of a nearby alley she had been walking by on her way home from work, dressed in nothing more than a light shirt, dark jacket and dark cargo pants. So it was only natural that Rei would march up to the alley without a second thought and stare thoughtfully at the odd shade of blue it had been, especially considering that the McDonald's it seemed to lead into had nothing to do with such a color. Red and yellow were more likely. This had been her original plan, if not for one consequential factor. A tiny, brown lab like mutt that she had tripped over. A natural lover of small animals, Rei had immediately twisted herself from falling and began spouting apologies at the animal, not noticing the wall she was bracing herself against. Or lack thereof, and she continued falling. In all of her 18 years, falling through a blue hole in a wall in the middle of Tokyo and crashing into another, much more solid, wall and getting herself knocked out was very easily the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened to her. Squinting as she reached the road, Rei stared somewhat blankly at the utter lack of pavement and concrete beneath her feet and dimly concluded that something was not right with this picture. She lived in a modern city, one that most certainly did not have dirt roads and colorful, old-fashioned buildings and people falling from the sky. Rei very nearly shrieked out loud and dove back in the alley as a dark figure fell very gracefully on the ground in front of her. Dashing behind the dumpster, she squeezed herself into as tight a curl as possible before a hand darted over her shoulder and pressed something cold to her neck. "Don't move." Rei froze at the hiss, not unaware of the sharp prick her small actions had caused as a small trickle of blood ran down her neck and into her shirt. Shit. Pseudo Nagao. Rei felt her attacker stiffen behind her. Must be his name, she idly thought as the same dark figure from before suddenly filled her vision. Another arm clamped across her shoulders and grabbed her dark jacket, drawing her up, sharp object still pressed against her neck. The man growled a curse under his breath and pressed a little harder, drawing more blood from Rei's neck. "I think you know the drill. I'm being held hostage." The thought was almost comforting in a way. So long as the man before her did nothing absolutely stupid as to jeopardize her health she was relatively safe. Until he got away and took her to some cabin in the woods and Rei suddenly found it difficult to breathe properly, cold metal notwithstanding. In an effort to distract herself from the tension she felt rising, she instead took in the features of the figure standing before her. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Rei nearly rolled her eyes. What is this, a costume party? Wearing some sort of white dog mask and Grim Reaper cloak will get you nowhere in life, my friend. In fact, it looked remarkably like Anbu? From the anime Naruto? Great. A cosplayer was her last lifeline. Rei never felt closer to hysterics, watching the Anbu wannabe slowly back away and bring his painted face to meet the attacker, eyes to eye holes. And the man dropped like a sack of potatoes, collapsing behind Rei. She gasped as the cold metal that had previously pressed against her throat still dug in as the man dropped the metal object, leaving a jagged trail of pain across her neck and down her collar. Rei swore and clapped a hand to the wound, feeling it spill blood with every heartbeat. Fan-freaking-tastic. She was going to die, and her only witnesses were the unconscious attacker unwittingly turned murderer and the cosplayer that held her up, pressing a gloved hand the wound and batting her own hand away. Rei didn't even have it in her to do much more than watch with a morbid fascination as the man's hand took on an ethereal green glow, tickling against her skin and dulling the pain that slowly faded to nothing. She stared with wide eyes at the dog mask as it nodded to her, picked up the comatose body behind her and slung him over his shoulder. Though the attacker was easily a foot taller, and sprang from wall to wall of the alley, reaching the roofs above and racing away. Well, shit. Ray let out a breathless laugh before slumping to the ground for the second time that day. Light, bright light. Ray felt it pierce through her eyelids as she slowly awakened to the world of the living. Ow! Ray winced as she sat up against the dumpster, uncomprehending of her situation until her hand trailed to her neck, which was completely pain-free. Why was that important? Oh, because some maniac with a knife or whatnot had cut her after dropping from eye contact with a cosplayer, who apparently healed her. Ray rolled her eyes to the heavens. What a weird dream then. Checking down herself, she idly brushed herself off and stood, a small shine catching her eye as she looked down. A kunai was laying at her feet. Ray bent down and picked it up curiously, noting how it seemed to be actually made of metal. Was it legal to make them so sharp? And it even had a red liquid on it, still drying apparently. Ray touched the liquid with fascination, noting the texture. Then dropped the kunai as the word blood ran through her mind and she touched her shirt at her neckline. More blood. Drying blood, making her shirt rather uncomfortable to wear and making her squirm. Ew. Ray decided she'd had enough of this, walking as calmly as possible out of the alley, noting again the dirt roads and the colorful old-fashioned buildings, then taking in something else. People that sported odd swirls on their odd clothing and gave odd glances to Ray herself. She looked past the people for a moment and felt something short-circuit her mind. 4 faces, carved out with obvious reverence towards the subjects, looking regally over the people with stern gazes. 4 people, 4 Hokages, 4 characters from an anime that didn't exist. All carved on a mountain that shouldn't exist. Miss, are you alright? Ray stared blankly at the man that had spoken, one that had a green vest that seemed more like armor and a bandana with a metal plate on it. She took in the swirled leaf engraved with a solemn gaze, merely nodded in acknowledgement towards the man, and turned and marched right back into the alley. Ray then curled into a tight little ball behind the dumpster and wondered when she would wake up in a padded cell, because Konoha was easily the last place she wanted to be. With any luck, this was all just some crazy-ass dream. Not that she felt especially lucky these days. Ray shivered against the dump's home base. She almost smirked. Home base indeed. The sight of her mysterious appearance, of her being held hostage, and now the only place she trusted to not cave in over her head or collapse under her. To Ray, to walk out of the alley would be admitting that she had done the impossible and gone into a fictional dimension. Because Konoha was not real. To say otherwise was a one-way ticket to the nearest happy home. Somewhere all good people wished to avoid. So Ray was going to sit in her little home base until she could look outside the alley and see modern people and modern buildings and no ninjas. If she ever got back to the real world, she would forever side with pirates. She'd never say stuff like a ninja had more class, or that jutsus were way more badass than any move Jack Sparrow could pull. Sea turtles all the way. She'd get a freaking tattoo of Davy Jones on her arm if she could just get home. Ray stopped her thoughts short as her stomach suddenly rumbled, cursing herself blue in the face. Right, her plan wouldn't work because people didn't live in alleys, home base or not. So what if she was wearing cargo pants and a jacket and a blood-stained t-shirt in the middle of a, not real, ninja village? So what if it was the middle of the night by now? Wait, that was important. Morning it would be, Ray decided, taking in the meager light from the lamp across the street from her alley. Deciding that she didn't quite feel tired, she instead pulled her jacket a little tighter around herself and picked up the kunai she had dropped earlier. Looking it over, she thought it was almost special, in the way that it had her blood all over it and had nearly killed her that day. Right. Ray hesitated before scrubbing the sharp edge with her shirt, carefully removing the now dried blood. It was a painstaking task. The shirt was nearly cut on the kunai, and Ray preferred to have her shirt intact, and by the time she'd finished she was left with a clean kunai and an even dirtier shirt. She admired the small weapon before curling in on herself, trying to ignore how cold it was. What if this was real? Ray frowned. She needed sleep, not questions of her sanity. But she stared at the kunai clutched in her hand with a troubled expression. What if I can't get back home? She murmured to herself, turning it over in her hand. There was one thing she was certain of though. She did not want anything to do with Uzumaki Naruto. It wasn't out of cruelty, she simply knew that he would get along fine on his own. Getting involved with his life was a one-way ticket to an early death, especially considering his enemies. Rei had no desire to get into any conflicts, or to do anything for a place that was not her home, despite her predicament. If she was lucky, she'd never meet Naruto or his emo rival. Or his perverted sensei. Or the Hokage. He was most definitely on Rei's list of people to avoid. Maybe if she didn't get involved, things would turn out okay. Waking up at dawn, Rei took one look at the four faces still carved into the mountain and entertained the brief idea that this was all real. Only to snort in disbelief. Like she would really end up in Konoha. She'd read stories about that happening. If she really had been in Konoha, all the stories said she would go straight to the Hokage Tower and tell him everything. Then she'd be trained in ninja arts, fall in love with some hot ninja, and save the world. It usually turned out okay for the girl, but did she really want that? Obvious disillusionment aside, Rei didn't want to be a ninja. She especially didn't want to get mixed up in Naruto's life, when interference was something that could easily get her killed. So what if Sasuke had a crappy fate? So what if Konoha was invaded? It wasn't Rei's problem, not at all. If she went to the Hokage and told him everything, she'd either be viewed as a spy or held to prevent every bad thing from happening. She knew, judging by the fact that there were only 4 heads on the mountain, that the Sandaime was likely still alive. Which begged the question, when in the Narutoverse was she? Assuming it was all real, of course. Sighing, Rei zipped her jacket to hide her bloody shirt and walked out of the alley, hands in her pockets. She frowned at an old couple that stared openly at her. What? She didn't think she was that weird. With dark hair, dark eyes and average height, she usually blended into any. Rei glanced down at her attire, comparing it to the ninja gear and civilian clothing. She stuck out like a sore thumb. Damn imagination, generating people that she didn't fit in with. Rei then passed a food stand, the smell setting off her stomach in a loud protest that the woman behind the counter obviously heard. Rei flushed crimson and ducked her head, quickly walking away as the woman shot her a look. The process was repeated about 2 more times before she scowled and marched to the nearest vendor, probably terrifying the poor man in the process. "Excuse me, sir?" The man eyed her appearance, rather unkempt from sleeping in an alley, and only nodded gruffly. She attempted to remove her customary scowl and schooled her features into a weak smile. "Ah, I was wondering if this ain't no charity girl." He cut her off. "Unless you have money, no food." Rei flushed. "Well, she snapped her mouth shut at the withering glare and glared back at him, walking away and rubbing the back of her ear in irritation. Finally telling her pride to screw itself, she walked a few blocks before a food smell set off her stomach again and she followed her nose to a different stand. Smiling at the man behind the counter, she cut him off before he could speak, eyes boring into his. "I have no money, and I want to work for food." On cue, her stomach gurgled loudly, and she blushed and bowed her head before adding meekly, "Please?" When the man said nothing, Rei's shame came crashing down and she drooped slightly, but didn't let up. "I'm a hard worker, honest. I can do anything you need around here. Hell, I can learn to play guitar and be entertainment." She was cut off by the man placing a steamy bowl of soup like noodles in front of her. Rei stared, mouth agape, a bit of drool at the corner of her mouth. You wouldn't think it had only been 24 hours since she last ate. Rei glanced up at the man, and his only response was to hand her a pair of chopsticks. Grinning, she struggled to snap them apart and with a quick, thanks, dug into the meal. Slurping the last of the salty noodles, she began to thank the man at a rate that nearly left her breathless. "Thank you so much, you have no idea how hungry I was and if I could ever repay you." The man chuckled and held up a hand. "Do you like ramen then?" Rei blinked in confusion, then glanced down at the empty bowl before her. "Oh," she nodded. "Very delicious, sir. I've never tasted its equal." Which was true. All the ramen in the world couldn't compare to that meal. Even if her hunger may have been a biased factor. He chuckled. "Thank you. What's your name, girl?" She smiled politely at him. "Rei." She bowed her head in a rare sign of respect. After all, he just fed her in her time of need. "Kuroda Rei." He bowed his own head in return. "Rei, huh? Suits you. I'm Tucci." Rei froze, then proceeded to read the sign above the menu as Tucci continued. "Welcome to Ichiraku's. If you're in need, I can give you a job as a kitchen help. Ray nodded dumbly, mind racing. Shit, didn't she just tell herself that morning not to get involved? Ah well, it's not like serving at Naruto's favorite restaurant would do anything. Besides, she just needed to work here for at least a week then find a different job. It couldn't hurt for now. So she plastered a smile on her face and tried not to twitch in agitation. At least she liked ramen. When the sun finally set over the village, Ray collected the last of the ramen bowls, bringing them in the back of the kitchen and rolling up her sleeves to wash them. You did good today. Tucci smiled at her as he put away his ingredients. Thank you for the help. Ray nodded back. Thank you for the job, Tucci-san. Ray might have struggled with the suffix if she hadn't been living in Tokyo for the past year. She had never been happier with learning Japanese, seeing how it was what everyone spoke around here. She hesitated. What could she say? That she had needed it because she was from a different dimension and was lost? Tucci looked at her oddly. How did you get so hungry? He asked gently. Ray nearly jumped a foot in the air. What? What? She nearly slapped herself for the stutter. You obviously didn't have a job before, and I'm assuming you had a way to get food before. Why not now? Ray flinched. She did not want to explain this. Tucci held up a hand. Easy there, I'm just concerned. I'm sorry, it really isn't my business. But, Tucci then went in the back, then came back with a small envelope in hand. Here, payment for the month. Ray's eyes widened as she took in the envelope's contents. Tucci-san, Tucci chuckled. I trust you'll come back bright and early tomorrow morning, right? Ray nodded firmly as she walked off, stuffing the envelope in her pocket. Of course, I'll work it off, I promise. 1 month. 1 month of working here and then she could find something else. In the meantime, she needed dinner. And shelter. Dinner was a priority. Ray wandered down a few streets, keeping a careful eye on how far off from the ramen stand she was, until she found a closing market that sold fruit. Buying a few apples and a loaf of bread, she needed to conserve her money for the month. After all, she continued down the street. Then she stopped and stared openly at a small alley, dashing in and noting the dumpster and disturbance of ground. Ray twitched again, feeling hysteria creep up on her. Home base. Looking around, Ray made herself comfortable in the spot she'd slept the night before, curling in on herself and pulling her sleeves over her hands. She'd asked Tucci in the morning where she could find a cheap apartment, if she could afford one. Eating 2 of the 3 apples and half of the bread, she tucked the rest in her jacket pocket. Pulling out the kunai from her pants pocket, she scratched the words, home base, into the dumpster side with a twisted smile on her face, slipping the kunai in her pocket again. Maybe she was going insane. Either way, it was with a shiver that Ray huddled into herself like the night before, attempting to sleep. It could still be worse. There he is. Don't let him get away. Eyeing the blonde, huddled figure that suddenly dashed into the alley and crouched behind the dumpster in front of her, Ray decided she had most definitely just jinxed herself. She listened to the 2 men that tore past them, shouting threats after the boy in front of her. Ray choked back a hysterical laugh after they were gone, making the boy jump a foot in the air and turn to her, eyes wide. Yipe! He froze as they made eye contact, he taking in her huddled position and she taking in his disarrayed countenance. He looked to only be 7 or 8 of age, dressed in a tatty shirt and a pair of shorts, with shoes that appeared too big for him. After a moment of silence, Naruto, as Ray knew him to be, relaxed somewhat, though she knew he would be gone at the first signs of hostility. Who are you? He finally asked, voice quiet but eyes suspicious. Ray made sure to not move, made sure she was careful not to scowl at the poor boy as she only gave him a blank stare. Kuroda Ray, you? He chose not to answer, instead keeping his mouth firmly clamped shut and proceeding to watch her carefully. Ray looked over the whisker marks on his cheeks and smiled slightly. He looked rather adorable. What are you doing here? Ray blinked at the straightforward question then scowled lightly. About to sleep, thank you. You woke me up. He flinched slightly. Sorry, but why would you sleep here? Don't you want to go home? He asked. Ray raised an eyebrow. Bold little guy, eh? Obviously, I would love to go home. Ray offered lightly, dark sarcasm dripping from her voice. If I had one anywhere near here. Naruto slumped slightly, eyes softening. Oh. The 2 stared at each other in silence. Ray uncurling very slowly under his watchful gaze. Naruto finally looked away, kicking the dirt. I don't have a home either. Ray paused. Didn't he have an apartment? Or at least the orphanage? Nowhere. None. Naruto looked at her. I used to live in the orphanage but… He frowned and looked away, rubbing his bare arms. They didn't want me there anymore. Ray watched him shiver in the cold for a moment. Ah, she didn't question him, easily guessing the reasons behind such. Except he didn't know it. Anyo. Ray looked at him blankly. He looked somewhat sheepish. I'm sorry I barged in. I mean. He sniffled slightly and crouched down, fiddling with the dirt. Ray felt her heart break in two at the sight. He looked just like a lost puppy in that moment. Ray had a soft spot for small animals. Hey, she finally said, reaching out an arm. Come here. Naruto flinched and looked at her, standing and backing away a little. Ray smiled disarmingly. It's okay. It's just cold, right? You look like you could use some warmth. Seeing how he didn't run, but also didn't come closer, she unzipped her jacket and shrugged it off, holding it out. Here, you look colder than me. He stared wide-eyed at her bloody shirt. What happened to you? Ray shrugged, frowning slightly at the thought that she would need to go clothes shopping soon. Just some bad luck with a guy being chased by a ninja. It's fine though. He hesitated but inched closer, taking her jacket and wrapping it around himself. Ray almost shivered but held it in. However, Naruto squinted at her, as though trying to see through her. Then he plopped himself next to her, huddling into her side. Thanks, he murmured. Ray hesitated then tugged at him, pulling him into her lap and wrapping her arms around him. He went stiff at the contact, but slowly relaxed and leaned on her shoulder. Curling around the boy, Ray nuzzled her head in his spiky hair and sighed, idly remembering her promise to not interfere with his life. This was probably the last she would ever see of him again, but it was still a risk. Nah, thank you. It was a little lonely here. Ray joked awkwardly. She then curled a little tighter as he shivered. Hey, Naruto. The boy flinched harshly and she suddenly remembered that he hadn't introduced himself, and that he probably thought that she was going to hurt him. It's okay. Not everyone hates you. Naruto didn't say anything, but judging by the shaking of his shoulders and the wetness on her arms it was something he needed to hear. Ray was awakened by the stirring in her arms, and her eyes snapped open at the memory of the night before. Shit. Ray blinked down at the figure in her lap, then looked in the sky. It seemed to be about dawn, and she didn't want to be late for her new job. Tucci had been generous, after all. Naruto, wake up. The boy in her arms flinched and jerked back, tumbling onto the ground with an oof. He sat up with a start, staring at her before slowly relaxing. Oh, right. Morning. Ray nodded at him before standing with a sigh, dusting off her pants. Naruto stretched, beaming at her. Ray smiled slightly in return. It was nearly impossible not to, after all. He then pulled off the jacket and handed it to her. Thanks, Ray said, pulling it on and zipping it again. Don't want people to freak at the blood, right? Naruto nodded eagerly. They stared at each other awkwardly before Ray shrugged. Yeah, okay, bye. And she walked out of the alley and down the street, trying to remember the way to Ichiraku's. Ray med as she followed a street that looked familiar, tugging the bread out of her pocket and nibbling at it. She frowned at the taste. Apparently it had gone hard overnight. Well, beggars couldn't be choosers, right? At least she'd lose weight. Ray frowned at the street sign above her and looked both ways, trying to remember the way before walking up to a nearby stand. Excuse me? Do you know the way to? Back. The old man behind the counter suddenly barked. I want nothing to do with your kind. Ray blinked incomprehensibly then scowled heavily. Me? What the hell did I do? The man seemed to then notice her. I'll be with you in a moment, miss. He then turned to see something behind Ray. Now get out of here, demon. He snarled before disappearing in the back. Ray turned so quickly she almost felt dizzy. Naruto. Naruto stared up innocently at her, eyes wide. Ray blinked rapidly. What? I said back. The man had returned, a broom in hand. He moved with a speed that didn't fit his age and stood beside Ray, holding up the broom in a swing. Go back to where you came from, you devil. Ray watched Naruto flinch, but he didn't move. She froze slightly before reaching forward and grabbing Naruto by the back of his shirt, yanking him out of the path of the broom and pulling him close when the man turned to her with wild eyes. What the hell are you doing? Ray didn't answer, instead taking Naruto's hand and dragging him away as she ran. Naruto followed without hesitation. Dragging him behind a corner, she released him and scowled at him, half in worry and half in irritation as she reached up to her ear with her eyes squeezed shut. "What are you doing?" Naruto flinched slightly, looking down and muttering something under his breath. "What? You said you were lonely." Ray blinked and remembered that yes, she had said something along those lines the night before. The lack of food must be getting to her. Naruto looked up and smiled widely. "So am I though. So now we can't be lonely if we take care of each other." Ray openly gaped at his logic as he grinned up at her, rubbing the back of his head. "And you took real good care of me. You even saved me from that guy with the broom. So the least I can do is make sure you have someone to hang around with. We could be, you know." He slowly dropped his grin and looked down, kicking the dirt much like he had last night before looking up with wide eyes. "Friends?" Ray stared at him, thoughts racing. No, she couldn't be friends with him, because he would be fine without her and she couldn't interfere. And he was staring at her with wide, pleading eyes, waiting for an answer from one of the few people that hadn't tossed him aside or tried to hurt him. Damn her guilty conscience, and damn him for looking akin to a kicked puppy that had just found a friend. "Alright, we'll be friends," Ray finally said. When the boy threw her a smile as bright as the sun, she didn't have it in her to really regret it. After all, it wasn't like one more friend in the world would really change anything. Ray froze when he threw his arms around her leg, him barely coming up to her waist when they both stood. "Thank you," he said sincerely, and she only ruffled his hair in reply. Soft and spiky, just like anyone would imagine. She squatted down to his level and looked him in the eye, tugging the last apple from her pocket. "Fine then, but I have to go to work now." Ray hesitated. If you, know, need something, you can find me at work. I work over at Ichiraku's ramen stand. You know where that is?" She tried not to stare incredulously when he shook his head. Naruto, the boy named after ramen, not having heard of his favorite stand? Blasphemy. "I'll show you, but then I have to work. I need food too, you know." Ray stood straight and nodded to herself, shoving a hand in her pocket and pulling out an apple. She glanced down at Naruto, then shoved the apple in his hand and walking off without a word. Naruto quickly fell into step behind Ray, eating the apple with a delighted expression on his face, despite his new friend's standoffish countenance and odd accent. Someone didn't hate him. Someone actually cared. Sure, he knew that not everyone hated him. The old guy with the funny hat that used to visit him at the orphanage was proof of that. Naruto hadn't seen him since he was kicked out a month ago, however. Which was a shame, because this was usually the time of the month that he would visit. Oh well. He munched thoughtfully on the little bits of apple left on the core as Ray walked up to a man with a broad face and a kind smile, nodding when he gave her instructions to work in the back before looking at Naruto with a curious look on his face. Ray paused, then ruffled Naruto's hair one last time, stating that she got off work when it got dark, and left without another word. Naruto gave the man behind the counter a hesitant smile as they regarded each other, unsure of the other. Finally the man smiled at him and asked if he had ever tried ramen before, immediately going to the back when the boy shook his head. Unknown to the two, Ray had a small, barely perceptible smile on her face as she watched Naruto's face light up when he first took a bite of the ramen Tucci had thought to give him. Maybe this wouldn't be too bad. "Ray-chan, are you sure?" "Naruto, for the last time. You need a place to stay too, and if they can't accept you while I'm looking, then they won't let you walk through the door. Understand?" Naruto only looked up at Ray with large eyes before turning away. "I understand," he said softly. Ray nodded firmly and grabbed his hand again. "Good. Now come on, the fifth time is usually the charm." Really? Probably not. They had been searching for an apartment for almost an hour and a half now, looking for somewhere that Ray decided looked cheap enough to survive with only her ramen stand envelope, which was just over enough for a nice rabbit hutch, and didn't take one look at Naruto before kicking them out. Luckily Tucci had given Ray a long list of cheap apartments. Who knew there were so many in Konoha? And they had only crossed out 4 of the apartments? 3 of them due to their Naruto intolerance and another due to high prices, which Ray had verbally chewed the owner out for after the discovery of a rodent infestation. Scowling down at the piece of paper in her hand and rubbing her ear, Ray almost didn't notice it when Naruto slipped his hand out of her own and began tugging her pants. "Anyo, Ray-chan." Ray blinked and looked down. Naruto fidgeted uneasily. Why are you so nice to me?" he asked, looking up pleadingly. You keep defending me, you want me to stay with you, you feed me, but everyone else. He hesitated. People have started saying bad things about you too, just because you're with me. Ray blinked at that. It was true that she had seen people around her whispering a lot that night, but she had simply assumed it was because of her clothes or even her accent. Despite her best efforts, her Japanese was still not up to perfect par. But it made sense that they would assume that she was some sort of evil to be involved with the Kyuubi brat. Looking down at the boy before her, knowing his personality in the future, it was easy to guess how he felt about that. Ray slowly knelt until she was at his level, clearing her throat so she was looking him in the eyes. She wasn't really a touchy-feely person, and she didn't smile all that often either, but at least she could take a shot at what kind of words Naruto needed to hear now, given a page out of his own future speeches. Naruto, she said slowly, making sure he was listening. Remember what you asked me to do for you this morning? Naruto blinked up at her in confusion. I asked, to be friends? He asked hesitantly. Ray nodded. That's right. And do you know how friends act? Naruto ducked his head sheepishly. Not really. Ray hummed, idly brushing a spike of blonde hair out of Naruto's eyes and tilted his chin to meet her gaze again. Well, a friend is someone you can count on in any situation. She said, never breaking eye contact with Naruto. Someone that you can trust with anything and everything, and someone you can trust to watch your back. A friend is someone that will never betray you, and will never let you down. Ray nodded at Naruto's wide-eyed gaze. That's actually mostly a best friend, but I think you can qualify for that. Her gaze softened as she stood. You asked why I'm helping you, right? Naruto nodded, still looking at her in bewilderment. I'm helping you because you are the most honest, most kind-hearted kid I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. Someone like you was willing to be friends with me even after only meeting me the night before, just because I said I was lonely. Ray allowed a rare, genuine grin to cross her face. That makes you pretty special, nay? Like my own little hero. Naruto gaped openly at her before grinning in reply. I am a hero, right? I'm Uzumaki Naruto, the greatest hero of all. He boasted, striking a pose with his fists in the air. And you're definitely my best friend, Ray-chan. Believe it? Naruto whooped as Ray's grin dwindled into a smile and she ruffled his hair, walking along again. Come on hero, we still need somewhere to stay for the night. She said, motioning for him to follow. Naruto nodded eagerly before racing after her, requiring more effort to catch up with her longer legs. Fifth time's the charm, right Ray-chan? Probably not. Why do you keep saying that? Ray hefted the blonde boy on her back as she inserted her newly acquired key into the lock of the door. Her door. Ma. Ray-chan. Naruto slurred from his position. Ray shrugged him a little higher as she walked through the door. Did you find somewhere? Yeah, I got a one room for a great price. Come on, you need to sleep. Looking around, Ray took in the room, which held a bed at one end and a small refrigerator and stove at the other. A small wardrobe and cupboard stood bare, reminding Ray of her other chores, and a table stood in the middle looking as though it would fall apart at any given weight. In other words, it was tiny and fairly unsanitary, but Ray couldn't have been more pleased. Even if the lady at the counter had taken one look at the sleeping blonde she was piggybacking and stuttered like a bad engine, she had graciously allowed them the room at a cheap price. Ray estimated that if her monthly salary stayed how it was and she conserved her savings, she could easily keep herself and Naruto properly fed and clothed. And, based on her own knowledge of Naruto's childhood, he would probably get his own apartment soon, along with his own payment. Naruto yawned as Ray carefully set him in the bed, taking one look at the pillow and tossing it against the wall. She wrinkled her nose as it gave a large poof of dust at the impact. Ray-chan? Was the eighth time the charm? He asked sleepily, giving a smile. Ray shrugged, ruffling his hair as she pulled the covers over him. The 11th time, Naruto. She corrected absently. Now get to sleep. On cue, his stomach grumbled and he squirmed. Ray sighed. Sorry, we didn't have time for food. We can get some ramen in the morning, nay? Naruto smiled as he began to drift back to sleep. That's good, he muttered. Ichiraku's is the best, he yawned. The best ramen in the world. Believe it. Ray shook her head as his breathing evened out, signaling him falling into a deep sleep. Unbelievable. In only 2 days of her being in Konoha, Ray had somehow managed to befriend Uzumaki Naruto, somehow taking it upon herself to take care of him. Didn't she tell herself that he would be fine without help? Hadn't she immediately decided that interference was a long road that would probably only end in something akin to a bloody and violent death? But Naruto had looked up at her with large, puppy dog eyes, and Rei had immediately thrown that out the window. And her speech about friends earlier, what was that? Was she really going to try and mold Naruto like that? To try and fix up Konoha's #1 unpredictable, knuckle-headed ninja into something that couldn't handle the problems thrown at him later in life? Well, Rei finally reflected, setting herself down on the edge of the bed and curling up at the foot. If I'm going to interfere, I might as well try and make it better. Starting with that god-awful orange jumpsuit. Rei-chan, Rei-chan. Rei looked up sharply from where she was setting a bowl of ramen in front of a customer, nearly spilling it all over the man. Naruto? The man blinked at the name and followed Rei's gaze, watching curiously. Naruto raced up to the bar, out of breath. Rei-chan, the Hokage. Rei wiped her hands on her new pants and walked around the bar, meeting the overexcited Naruto in front. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Rei had gotten her new apartment, the two going clothes shopping the next day. Rei had fitted herself in shinobi-colored pants, the closest she could find to her customary cargo pants, and boots. Regular shirts went under her dark jacket, the only article of clothing left from her original attire. Naruto himself dressed in a simple pants and shirt, Rei buying him his own dark jacket with orange stripes down the sleeves and an orange lining. Soon the two were quickly settling into a routine. Each day Rei would go to work, leaving Naruto to his own devices for the day. She would come home and the two would have dinner. Luckily Rei knew a few recipes, and then loaf around the apartment, usually Rei reading a book from a bookstore across the street. She wondered idly when she was going to give in to the urge to look at the Icha Icha series on display. If only out of morbid curiosity, she refused to acknowledge that she might be a pervert. "What's wrong, Naruto?" Rei asked, looking down at the panting blonde in front of her. "What about the Hokage?" "The Hokage." Naruto let out a gasping breath, then beamed up at Rei. "I saw Oji-san when I was getting the groceries, and I did get the vegetables like you said, and he came up to me and said I'm gonna be a ninja." Rei let out a low whistle. She knew this day was coming, when the Hokage would finally enroll Naruto in the academy. And that meant, really? "Yeah, he told me to meet him at the Hokage Tower at 3. Rei glanced up at the clock. It was 2:45. "Isn't the Hokage Tower near the other side of town?" "Yeah, why?" Rei glanced again at the clock and shrugged. "No reason. What do you think he wants?" Naruto shrugged, grinning broadly. "I dunno, but he told me he'd tell me some good news when I got there. I had to tell you first. After putting away all your yucky vegetables, of course." Rei's lips twitched in a bemused smirk. "Thank you, Naruto. That's pretty exciting. You'll be a real hero, eh?" Naruto nodded. "I'll be the greatest ninja of all time. I'll be the Hokage." Rei blinked down at him, but Naruto was looking away and towards the Hokage mountain. "The Hokages are the greatest, aren't they? People like that, giving their lives for Konoha. And everyone sees them that way, as heroes." Naruto turned to Rei with a grin. "If I'm Hokage, then people will see me as a hero, right?" Rei could easily see this as a key development for Naruto. The moment where he decides the dream that steers all his actions in the series, to be Hokage. She nodded. "You'll be the greatest hero of all time, Naruto. I can guarantee it." Then Rei smirked. "But you'd better get going, hero. It's almost 3. Naruto gazed at the clock and his eyes widened comically. "Aiya, why didn't you tell me?" Rei smirked even wider as he was about to bolt, then frowned and caught his arm. "Hold up, hero." Naruto looked at her with panic. "But Rei-chan, I'll be late," he yelped. Rei shook her head. "There's one thing I gotta ask you, okay?" When Naruto hesitated and nodded seriously, she looked him in the eyes. "Don't tell the Hokage where you've been staying. Don't tell him about me." Naruto stared at her in confusion. "But, you can trust Oji-san, Rei-chan," he said, smiling in reassurance. "He doesn't hate me, and he definitely won't hate you. Believe it." Rei shook her head. "It's not that, it's..." She trailed off. He may not trust me, you know? He probably looks after you, and he might think that I'm not a good person." Naruto shook his head. "But you're a great person, Rei-chan. You're my best friend," he said incredulously. Rei nodded. "I know, but he may not believe me, okay? Please? For me?" She looked into Naruto's eyes pleadingly, letting out a sigh of relief when he nodded reluctantly. "Thanks." Naruto shot her a funny look but shrugged. Alright, but I really gotta go. With that he raced off, nearly crashing into a cart in his haste. Rei sighed in relief. She knew that anyone getting close to Naruto would probably be viewed with suspicion, probably be looked into. Rei also knew that the Hokage wouldn't find a single paper on Kuroda Rei, no matter how hard he searched. She had no papers, no background, and no way in hell of explaining any of that away. It would not be pretty. So she could only hope that Naruto could keep his head, and that he would be able to keep her a secret. God help the day that Rei was found by the Hokage. Sarutobi Hiruzen eyed the clock on the wall of his office with something akin to disbelief, puffing away on his pipe. Really, when he had met Naruto in the market, buying vegetables of all things, and told him he had something to tell him, he thought the boy would beat him back to the tower. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that the boy was looking better off than all his years in the orphanage. It would take a fool to not notice the new clothes, the more genuine grin on his face, and the fact that he was not nearly as thin as he used to be. Not to mention how careful he was about choosing the vegetables with a grimace on his face, as though the last thing he wished to be buying was the stuff. A normal reaction for any child, but highly unusual for one that, to the best of the Hokage's knowledge, had no one to tell him what he should and shouldn't eat. When he'd made his customary rounds to the orphanage for the month, it was with something akin to terror the old woman stuttered out how she'd kicked the boy out almost a month ago, selling what little clothing he had and keeping the usual monthly payment that the Hokage usually sent to the boy. There was never such a day as when the man had so enjoyed filling out certain paperwork for the woman's station transition. Still, he'd nearly gone white, his hair was still gray. Thank you very much, with worry as he realized the boy had likely been on his own the entire time, and had quickly decided on a new course of action in the boy's life. He'd been on his way to finish his little surprise when he'd run into the boy himself. Buying vegetables, with those new clothes and that genuine grin even as the stall owner eyed him with distaste. Oji-san. Hiruzen looked up as the boy in question burst through the door, looking as though he'd run the entire way to the tower. The man smiled down at him. Naruto. He allowed his features to become puzzled. You're late? Naruto rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Well, see, I had to put the groceries away and. He trailed off, looking unsure. I got lost. On the road to life? He said as almost a question. Halfway across Fire Country, an Enbu captain shivered violently, nearly giving himself away to the target shinobi he was stalking. After rubbing his bare arms and looking around thoughtfully, he shrugged and continued his work. The Hokage raised an eyebrow at the sad excuse, but let the matter go. Naruto, what happened at the orphanage? He asked kindly, looking the boy in the eye. Naruto fiddled with the edge of his jacket, looking down. They told me to go away, and that I shouldn't come back. He muttered to the ground. Or they'd break my legs so I couldn't run again. Crack. Sarutobi and Naruto blinked at the broken pipe sitting on his desk, snapped in half by the force of the Hokage's clenched teeth. He coughed awkwardly. I see. He swept the remains of the pipe into a small bin, reaching into his desk and pulling out another pipe. I was quite worried about you when I heard that you were kicked out. How have you been? Here Sarutobi watched in confusion as Naruto's face became carefully blank, as though he was unsure of what to tell the man. Naruto hesitated, then looked down. After a moment he looked up with a beaming face. I met this nice old man at a ramen stand. He gave me free ramen and was really nice to me. Ichiraku's is my new favorite place in the world, and ramen is amazing. Believe it. For a moment, the Hokage had a passing vision of a fiery redhead with a mischievous glint in her eye and an absolute love for ramen in place of the blonde boy in front of him, but it soon passed as he shook his head. He'd have to reimburse the man for his kindness. Interesting, he murmured, looking at Naruto casually. And where were you staying? Naruto stiffened. Naruto, the Hokage said gently, not liking the look in his eyes. Is something wrong? You can tell me anything you know. Naruto looked at him with wide eyes, stuttering slightly. He shook his head. I met a nice lady. He suddenly said in a rush. She bought me clothes and let me stay at her place and feeds me every day. But she didn't want me to tell people about her, so I said I wouldn't, but she said that friends are someone you can count on, and I can count on you to not tell anyone, because you're my friend, right Oji-san? Naruto looked up at the man with wide, round eyes, pleading with the man to not ask anything about this mysterious woman. The Hokage inwardly frowned. It was nice that the boy had found someone that seemed to call him a friend, but serving a starving boy ramen and taking in the village pariah were two completely different things, and that she wished to remain anonymous made it all the more suspicious. Outwardly the Hokage smiled warmly at the boy he'd come to care for and said that yes, he was his friend and that it was nice to hear he'd found a nice friend. He then went on to say that he'd found a nice apartment for the boy, chuckling as Naruto's jaw grew slack and his eyes went wide. Inwardly he decided that he was getting far too old for this job. Come on, Ray-chan. What's wrong with it? No, that's not a reason. Ray took another, shuddering look at the horrid orange jumpsuit that the boy had immediately run to the second they'd entered the store, and if possible her face went more deadpan than ever. Upon coming back from the tower, Naruto had immediately run up to her as she closed up shop with Tucci and told her all about his visit, saying how the man had enrolled him at the academy and how he now had his own apartment and that the Hokage was paying him and he could start wearing ninja clothes and… what was with that glint in Ray's eye? Ray had then taken him by the shoulders and said that she'd like to help him pick out his new attire, and Naruto was so excited that he practically dragged her all the way to the store that the Hokage had recommended. Come on, Ray-chan. It's orange. Ray shivered. Exactly. Naruto, she sighed and rubbed the back of her ear in irritation. Do you know why ninjas wear dark colors? Naruto made a face. Because they're boring? Ray sighed again. No, because they don't want to be seen. She said patiently. I know you like to be seen, Naruto, but what will you do if you're trying to stay hidden from someone that could easily kill you the second they saw you? Naruto's eyes widened at the logic before he looked thoughtfully at the orange suit again. I'd try to blend in, he finally said. Ray nodded in approval. Exactly, she said again. You are not going to go and make yourself a target for others, do you hear me? She said firmly, shaking the boy's shoulder a bit. There's nothing wrong with a little orange, but wearing something like that is like walking around with a "kill me" sign on your back. Come on, Ray said, dragging Naruto away from a horrible future of orange jumpsuits. Let's find something a little better. Naruto pouted as he allowed himself to look at the darker varieties of shinobi wear, watching Ray shift through several stacks of shirts and pants. You're just saying that, 'cause you like dark colors. He grumbled. Ray blinked down at her own dark attire and simply shrugged, bundling up the pile she'd made. Probably. Now try this. She shoved the bundle into Naruto's arms and shoved him towards the dressing rooms. And don't you dare think about sneaking away. Ray-chan. Naruto whined, but closed the door to the dressing room with a huff. Ray waited patiently until he emerged, then looked him up and down with a raised eyebrow. Nice. Ray had brought him some dark, typical shinobi pants, though with an orange strip running down both legs similar to the dark jacket Ray had bought him a while ago. Naruto wore a simple orange shirt under his jacket, customary whirlpool sign in the middle. Naruto shifted and tugged at his collar for a second, then grinned. It's actually not that bad. He chirped, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. You were right, Ray-chan. Too much orange is bad, but this is just right. Ray felt as though she had just done something amazing. Wakey, wakey, eggs and bakey. Naruto only twitched in his sleep and rolled over, mumbling to himself. Ray sighed and placed said food on a plate in the middle of the table, then walked over to shake him. Naruto, wake up. Don't wanna. Ray sighed again. Do you really want to be late to your first day at the academy, hero? She finally asked. Naruto shot up, eyes wide and fully awake. Am I late? He yelped, falling out of his bed and tangling himself in the sheets. Ray let him struggle for a minute, a smirk on her face, before he finally untangled himself and stared at Ray incredulously. Ray-chan? How'd you get in here? You gave me a key. Oh. Ray had let herself into Naruto's new apartment that morning, realizing that Naruto might just sleep in like he did every morning that he used to stay at Ray's own apartment. It was only a few days ago that they had moved Naruto into his apartment, and Ray decided to ask Tucci for a day off so she could make sure that Naruto had a good first day at the academy. Naruto rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and yawned. Ray-chan, am I really going to be late? Ray smirked. Nope, you actually have an hour to get ready and be there on time. Naruto whimpered, then blinked. Don't you have work? He asked. Ray shrugged. I got a day off. Not something I can do very often, mind you, but I figured today was a good reason. She said, motioning to the table as she cleaned up the pan from cooking and put it away. Naruto beamed, then sat at the table and began eating. MRPH mu MKMPHMNK? Naruto asked through a mouth full of eggs. Ray shot him an evil eye, making him swallow reflexively. Are you going to take me then? Ray nodded. I figured you might like someone to do that for you, she said, shrugging. It was what my mom did when I first started school. Naruto blinked, then stared hard at Ray. You went to the academy too? He asked incredulously. So you're a ninja? Ray blinked and shook her head. Different school, hero, she said flatly. Ninja stuff isn't for me. Naruto watched as Ray shivered from an unknown thought and shrugged. So, he trailed off, rubbing his arms. Ray-chan. Ray raised an eyebrow. Nervous? She asked. Naruto shook his head fiercely. No way, he exclaimed. I'm gonna be Hokage someday, so the academy doesn't scare me at all. Believe it, he trailed off. But, Ray watched as he looked up at her rather pitifully. What if they don't like me? He said meekly. Ray hesitated. It was a rather common question, and she could easily realize what he wanted to hear. She couldn't, however, lie to him. If that happens, she finally said, then you'll just have to show them how stupid they are. Naruto grinned, laughing. Right, because I'm. He trailed off as he saw the clock on his stand. I'm gonna be late if we don't leave soon. Shoving the rest of the food in his mouth, Naruto dressed in a flurry and all but dragged Ray out the door. Ray set the bowl of pork ramen in front of the man, watching in bemusement as he gave a start from where he was staring thoughtfully out towards the street. Oh, thank you Ray-san. No problem, Amino-san. Iruka smiled warmly, snapping apart his chopsticks and digging into the meal. When the man had first arrived nearly 2 weeks ago, Ray had nearly spilled ramen all over him in surprise, then inwardly scolded herself. Hadn't she known that the man was a ramen fan as well? Inwardly she wondered if she should mention to either Iruka or Naruto about the other, seeing how while both were regular customers yet had never been there at the same time. Nah, so how was class today? Ray asked politely. Iruka leaned back with a sigh. 1 month into another year, and I already can't keep up with the paperwork. Luckily Mizuki is pretty handy with that, and Iruka trailed off and seemed to debate with himself. And there's one student in particular, he said, carefully watching Ray's reaction. Uzumaki Naruto. Ray nearly dropped the bowl. Is something wrong? She asked sharply. Ray had never considered the fact that Iruka might be a Naruto hater, but he may have started that way. Nothing's wrong, Iruka said slowly. Just, confusing. Ray relaxed slightly. How so? She asked casually. Iruka watched her through narrow eyes. What do you think of Uzumaki? He asked suddenly. Ray blinked, then scowled at him. That depends, she said slowly. On what you would do with my answer. The Chunin held up his hands. I'm just curious about why you're so interested. He said disarmingly. You seemed almost worried. Ray debated on what to tell the man, then finally shrugged. He's a good friend of mine, she finally said, and not many people really look out for him. Iruka blinked in astonishment. Huh, he let out a long breath. So you're the one he always talks about. Ray blinked. Say what? She demanded. Iruka chuckled, rubbing his nose. He always goes on about how he's going to be Hokage someday. He said in bemusement, and how he'll be the greatest hero of all time and protect his friends. A student once asked him what friends. Ray scowled, but Iruka ignored this. And the kid stands and shouts to the entire class about a girl that told him that he would show everyone what a hero he could be. Didn't mention any names, but I'm guessing that was you, he said. Ray sighed, nodding. Always the little loudmouth, she muttered, though not unkindly. Noisy brat. He's been okay in class though? She demanded. Iruka rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Well, there was one incident with the chalkboard. I heard you called the Hokage a closet pervert in the middle of class. Naruto nearly spat out his 7th bowl of ramen, instead choking on it. Ray waited patiently for him to swallow, before asking him with a raised eyebrow, where did you even learn that word? Naruto rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Some of the students were talking about one of the Junin instructors being a pervert. He said sheepishly. So I asked them why, and he said it was because of the book he was reading. I remembered Oji-san has a book like the one they described, but he always keeps it hidden. So that makes him a closet pervert, right? Naruto asked brightly, proud of his logic. Ray only closed her eyes. That's right, Naruto. She finally managed. Naruto grinned, then looked at Ray carefully. You know, Ray-chan. He said slowly. Oji-san's book looks a lot like the orange one you keep in your pocket all the time. The one you won't let me read. Naruto, don't you want some more ramen? Rei stuffed a helping of noodles into Naruto's mouth, face crimson. Her morbid curiosity of late had developed into an unhealthy obsession with the Icha Icha series. Despite the smut, it was actually a good read. The plot was pretty good, the scenarios were simply hilarious, and the scenes were vivid. Rei-chan, why's your nose bleeding? Naruto looked worried. I've seen guys pass out from that. Are you okay? Rei only held a tissue to her nose and clung to what little dignity was being shredded by the boy in front of her. Come on, hero, she finally said after Naruto finished his ramen. Let's head over to the bookstore. I want to get something. Want me to lock up, Tucci-san? She called in the back. It's fine, Tucci stated, coming from the back. I'm expecting someone, so I'm running late. Go ahead though. Rei thanked him and she left, Naruto walking behind her. Walking in the store, she greeted the woman behind the counter. Kyo-san, she said. Kyo nodded at Rei. Rei-san, have you come for the latest Icha Icha? Or are you not finished with the last one? Rei blushed heavily and looked away. Not quite done with it. She managed. Naruto looked between the two before pointing at Rei accusingly. You're a closet pervert too, Rei-chan. He exclaimed loudly. Rei slapped a hand over his mouth and turned to Kyo pleasantly. I was wondering if my order came in, actually. She said. Kyo nodded and reached behind the desk. Like I said when you ordered it, it wasn't really popular enough to keep in stock. She said, handing a yellow book to Rei. I'm surprised you've even heard of it, even if the author is pretty popular now. Rei shrugged and paid for the book, as an afterthought buying a notebook as well. Morbid curiosity, was all she said. Kyo raised an eyebrow. Wasn't that what you said when you bought? Great to see you, Kyo-san. Rei said with an out-of-character note in her voice, dragging the still gagged Naruto out. She kept him like that until they reached the park, where she released him and he pouted. Rei-chan, he whined. Why did you drag me so you could just buy some stupid book? Rei pulled out the book from before and waved it in his face. And here I thought you might enjoy, The Legend of the Gutsy Ninja. She said in faint surprise. After all, the main character has your name. Rei pressed herself further into the wall, nearly crushing the boy behind her as she swore repeatedly in her head. Shit 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 shit. In retrospect, she might have seen this coming. When she had first met Naruto all those months ago, he'd been running from two men, after all. It was only natural that they'd come back months later, and that Rei and Naruto would meet them while walking back from the park where they'd been reading their respective books. And it was only natural that she would grab Naruto and run. Rei-chan, are they gone? Naruto whispered, clinging tightly to Rei's pants. Rei crouched down in front of Naruto as she scanned her surroundings. She trailed off. I don't think so, she said finally, just as one of the men shouted that he was going to look in the alley they'd hidden themselves in. Naruto whimpered and huddled even further, only to be pushed into a corner as Rei got in front of Naruto, whispering harshly to stay back. She stood just as the man came in the alley, immediately drawing attention from him. Well, the man drawled as he stumbled into the alley. Rei quickly realized he was intoxicated and scowled a little harder. If it ain't the little demon's whore. Rei felt her blood run cold as the man leered at her. Tell you what, Missy, he said lazily, give me the thing, and you can be my girl Instia, oof. The man was cut off by a very sharp kick from said girl to a very sensitive area. Like hell, Rei spat, eyebrow twitching uncontrollably. If you touch Naruto, I'll kill you myself. She snarled. The man swore as he stood, still grimacing in pain. He recovered and charged, fist swinging out for Rei. You bitch, he roared. Rei tensed. 6 years lessons better pay off in the near future. Arm up, deflect fist to side. Step in close, horrible smell of alcohol, definitely drunk, hooked to sensitive kidney. When the man exhaled sharply and leaned down to cover his injuries, Rei kneed him in the now easily accessible throat, twisting and turning the upward thrust into a roundhouse as her ankle hooked his shoulder. Crack, the man was sent back by Rei's twist into the wall behind him, slamming his head against the wall. The other man came in soon after, and at the sight of his unconscious partner similar yells and blows were traded. Then Rei quietly picked up the still shivering Naruto and carried him home, leaving behind two very broken and shamed men. I knew it, Naruto exclaimed for the third time. You are a ninja. He pointed dramatically at Rei, who sighed irritably and rubbed the back of her ear. No, Naruto, she said for the fifth time. I am not. Learning to defend yourself and being a ninja are not the same thing. For the sixth time since they arrived at Naruto's apartment, Rei checked to make sure the door and the tiny window were both locked tightly, tattered curtain drawn and everything. How could I be so stupid? Taking Naruto to the park on October 10th was, in retrospect, like walking off a ship and into shark-infested waters. True, she hadn't quite realized such until she had locked them in the apartment and taken a glance at the calendar, but it was still mainly her fault. If she hadn't been able to take care of the drunkards, what might have happened to Naruto would have been her fault too. Anyo, Rei-chan. Rei looked up and looked at Naruto, who was looking dangerously close to tears. I'm sorry, he mumbled. Rei blinked. What? She said incredulously. No, I'm sorry, Naruto. I should have realized the date. The park was easily the most idiotic thing I could have done. Not to mention, she added sheepishly, that I forgot to get you a birthday present. Naruto stared at Rei as though she'd grown two heads and a tail. Or maybe started wearing a pink dress and smiled as often as he did. Rei-chan, Naruto said softly. He tried to hurt you to get to me. I'm supposed to protect you though. Because I'm going to be a ninja. Naruto threw himself at Rei, nearly cutting off any circulation in her legs. And all I did was hide. Rei blinked down at Naruto. Naruto, she said slowly. You hid because you did the right thing. When Naruto looked up at her incredulously, she fixed him with a hard gaze. What would I have done if I would have had to get you away from the men and defeat them at the same time? She cut off any protests. You're still in the academy. Your taijutsu is your worst subject. I know Iruka, remember? You would have been creamed. And then I would have been trying to fight two men at the same time, with a little kid that I would have had to save at the same time. I would have been creamed. She tilted Naruto's chin up so that he was looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. You would have gotten us both killed. Naruto finally burst into tears, clinging to Rei and sobbing his little heart out. Rei's eyes softened and she ruffled his hair gently. Ah, Naruto, she murmured. There's always going to be someone stronger than you, right? That's why you have friends to save you. You can't be the hero all the time. Sitting on the edge of Naruto's bed, she drew him into her lap and held him tightly. And it may sound rather stupid, but happy birthday anyway. Rei finally went home an hour later, promising to take him to pick out a present if she could get the day off tomorrow. Inwardly she knew that Teuchi would do that for her in a heartbeat. She hadn't had a day off since Naruto first started in the academy 3 months ago. She didn't notice the bone-white mask with red markings watching her walk back home, nor the way it vanished in a swirl of wind and leaves. The second Rei locked the door of her apartment, she put her newly purchased notebook on the table and sat herself down with a sigh, picking up a pencil she'd borrowed from Naruto's apartment. And she wrote down everything that she could remember about the manga. The first page she created as a reference to Naruto, writing down every little fact about him she could remember. Even the orange jumpsuit, though now she'd never have to see that monstrosity ever again. Favorite food, his godfather's name, the fact that he housed the Kyuubi, and eventually a list of significant events in his life. October 10th. Uzumaki Kushina, former Jinchuriki of Kyuubi, gives birth to Naruto, named after character in Jiraiya's book, Legend of Gutsy Ninja. Father Namikaze Minato, aka 4th Hokage, is then confronted by Uchiha Madara who releases Kyuubi due to weakened seal at childbirth. Parents die sealing last of chakra in Naruto. Unknown date, age 12. Fails Ninja Academy for third time until tricked by teacher into stealing scroll from Hokage. Learns Kage Bunshin and about the Kyuubi. Gets placed on Team 7 with Junin Hitaki Kakashi and 2 Genin Sakura and Uchiha Sasuke. First part. Gullible idiot. Second part. Gullible strong idiot. Rei then moved on to Sasuke, writing down everything she could remember of him and Itachi, from details on the Sharingan to general comments on his personality and behavior. Seemed to be emotionally stabilizing until appearance of Itachi and Sharkman partner looking for Naruto. First part. Unstable emo set off at any mention of power or Itachi. Second part. Sadistic bastard still set off by Itachi. Freakishly powerful and generally overuses the word revenge. Rei then moved on to Sakura, though there weren't many things on the girl she could remember. She still did the best she could, noting her chakra control and place in team. First part, fangirl. Second part, prodigal medic nin with super strength. Rei also wrote a section on Kakashi. Though the Kakashi Gaiden was fairly hazy in her mind, she only wrote that he was a prodigy that became Chunin at 6 and an Uchiha had given him Sharingan in his dying moments. Bastard rule follower as child. Constantly late and laid back as adult. Here Rei squinted her eyes at her own words, then scribbled a WTF on the side. Fan of Icha Icha. Somehow gets Mangekyo during 2-year break. Special disposition towards teamwork and how team members should act. First part. Lazy with weird mood swings. Second part. Lazy with weirder mood swings. Rei wrote on into the night, writing everything she remembered of the main characters, though mostly Team 7 and the Sennin, until she finally moved on to the general happenings in Naruto. Rei wrote on their first C-rank mission, though leaving out things she couldn't remember, though mostly specifics of the first attackers. She wrote about the Chunin exams and how Orochimaru attacked and cursed Sasuke. She wrote about the Sandaime dying and how Naruto went with Jiraiya to find Tsunade, learning the Rasengan. She wrote about Sasuke's defection, making vague notes about the sound nins that the team had to fight until the battle in the Valley of the End. She then wrote how Naruto left with Jiraiya for 2.5 years, coming back to find Akatsuki. Rei then wrote about Madara's plan to extract the Biju and create a 10-tailed monster, also creating a whole section on Akatsuki and every member she could recall. She put in every tiny detail she could remember, seeing how any of it wouldn't happen for at least another 4 years. And she hadn't even touched the manga since she was 16. Memory tended to fail after that time. As a failsafe, she wrote it all in English. She hoped that her constant use of Japanese around here wouldn't make her forget any English. Then she'd be screwed. Ah well. Rei sat back with a sigh, rubbing her sore wrist and raising an eyebrow at the clock. This was more important, she decided, than a good night's sleep. Just in case she needed to remember something later. She resolved to keep the small notebook with her from now on, seeing how losing it would be absolutely unacceptable. Rei then hoped that this wouldn't all come back to bite her in the ass. Your report, Jackal? The Hokage watched the Anbu in front of him with a solemn look on his face, looking every bit the intimidating professor he was known to be. The shinobi in front of him shifted uneasily, before reporting in a blank monotone. At school it was fairly stressful. One of the teachers would shoot Uzumaki glares throughout the entire lesson, but the other managed to balance out the day. The boy sulked all the way to his usual meal at Ichiraku's until the girl. Here the Anbu faltered, something that the Hokage noted with a raised brow. Jackal, I need to know everything about Naruto's day, he said sternly. Just report, until the girl brought up the fact that he had called you, forgive me Hokage-sama, a closet pervert in the middle of class. Sarutobi didn't even twitch, but inwardly decided to have a talk with the boy sooner or later. When the man didn't outwardly react, the Anbu continued. The two talked for a while until the girl took Uzumaki to a small bookstore and picked up a book. She then took him to the park where they spent approximately 2.5 hours reading. Sarutobi raised an eyebrow. Naruto? Reading? According to Iruka, the boy had to be forced to read anything. The books? He asked curiously. The girl brought a volume of Icha Icha Paradise. Sarutobi coughed lightly, and she gave the book she had purchased to Naruto. The Legend of the Gutsy Ninja. At this the elderly man raised both eyebrows. Could she? No, impossible. But still intriguing. Go on, he said, leaning back and closing his eyes. And when they left the park they were attacked by 2 drunk civilians. The Hokage's eyes snapped open and he was at attention all at once. Did you interfere? He demanded, scowling slightly at the man. When the man shook his head he nearly exploded, but stopped short at his next words. I didn't need to. Hiruzen blinked as he continued. The girl displayed admirable skill in an odd taijutsu. What style exactly? Sarutobi asked. The Anbu shook his head. I've never seen anything like it, he said in monotone, but Sarutobi had been a shinobi too long to not hear the slight frustration in his voice. It was a style without any basic stance or forewarning, instead relying on the target's own attack to pull their body into a leverage. In essence, it was their own strength turned against them. The scuffle lasted only 45 seconds. Sarutobi leaned back with a sigh. Suspicious, but still not on a good basis for any investigation. Can you say she was a shinobi then? The Anbu paused, then shook his head. No, her movements were only civilian-level speed, and the men were not fatally wounded. It was more surprise than anything that downed them, although I believe that is the point of the odd style. She also displayed a very small amount of killing intent, suggesting only minor experience with actual fighting. Sarutobi med to himself. What happened after that? The boy was severely distressed, and the girl carried him to his apartment. I believe she was given a spare key to it, and locked themselves inside of it for an hour. She then retired to her own apartment for the night. The Hokage nodded, again leaning back. Thank you, Jackal. A report on what you've learned about the girl? The Anbu nodded. Her name is Kuroda Rei. Dark hair and dark eyes. Wears dark shinobi colors, though it seems more out of personal preference than anything. Has an odd scar on neck the shape of a lightning bolt across her jugular. Works full days at Ichiraku's ramen, and lives in a small apartment about 10 blocks from it. Uzumaki is in daily contact with her. Sarutobi nodded again. Half of that he'd already heard from Iruka, among other things. And if what Iruka says is true, she has a considerable influence over him. He muttered, almost to himself. If she's trying to manipulate the boy for her own means, it has yet to show though. He continued on. If anything, Naruto only seems to be more dedicated to Konoha than ever. I can't imagine why she wouldn't want Naruto to mention her to me. Actually sir, Jackal hesitated. When we first learned the girl's identity, Falcon ran a background check on her. Sarutobi raised an eyebrow. And? Nothing, Hokage-sama. Falcon couldn't even find an eyewitness account of the girl until 5 months ago. The Hokage blinked. Falcon was the head of the investigations branch of the Hunter Nins, a division renowned for their information gathering. 5 months. When Naruto was kicked out of the orphanage. He said suddenly. Jackal inclined his head. She was wandering the streets in foreign clothes and looking for food and work until she came to Ichiraku's. She lived in the streets for a few days. Around this time the Uzumaki was reported following her around, before purchasing her apartment. Before that is anyone's guess. Jackal shook his head in slight dismay. And not to mention her odd accent, along with the fact she may as well be a ghost. Jackal shrugged. It's like she's from another world. Ray-chan, why not? Give me one good reason why. Because it's cool. Ray looked in obvious distaste at the toad sitting in Naruto's hand. I'll pass, she said blankly. Naruto pouted. Come on, at least pet it. No, just a pat? Naruto, I hate amphibians. That's okay, this is a frog. Ray slapped her forehead. Do you want to go shopping today or not? She finally demanded, rubbing her ear in obvious agitation at the green animal Naruto had discovered while waiting for her to show up. Naruto tilted his hands, spilling the frog onto the grass in front of his apartment before looking at Ray with an uncharacteristically serious expression. No, I don't want that for my birthday, he said, crossing his arms stubbornly. Ray blinked. What do you want then? I know those goggles are pretty cool, she said, indicating the shiny objects proudly atop Naruto's head. He'd discovered the package that morning, with a birthday wish from the Hokage himself. But I want to get you something too. Naruto nodded seriously. I want you to teach me taijutsu. Ray blinked down at the boy very, very slowly before sighing. Naruto, she said slowly. We've been over this. I am not a ninja. Naruto scowled. I know that, he said, but I want you to teach me to fight how you did. It was so cool, he exclaimed in excitement. They were like, rawr. But then you just stood there and went right up to them and you kicked that one guy in the... Naruto. Ray squeezed her eyes shut. Why would you want to learn that? She finally managed. Ninja don't use that fighting style. Aren't you learning taijutsu at the academy? Naruto pouted. But it's hard, Ray-chan. He whined. They're always telling me I have to move a certain way and I end up getting hit because I do it wrong. But you didn't get hit even once. Please? He begged, eyes wide and pleading. For my birthday? Damn whoever invented puppy dog eyes to hell and beyond. Ray sighed heavily. Fine. She scowled and stalked away, a fiercely grinning Naruto at her heels. She could easily imagine the large bone in his mouth and wagging tail. She then resolved to buy a dog in the near future. They walked until they reached a more secluded area of the park, Ray stopping and holding out a hand for him to stop. Before I teach you anything, she suddenly said, staring Naruto in the eyes. I want you to promise me something, right now. 2 things, actually. Naruto nodded eagerly. Anything, Rei-sensei. He chirped. Rei twitched. 3 things then. 1. Don't call me sensei. I'm not teaching this to you because you're my student. I'm teaching this because you're one of the few people I know in Konoha, and you're practically family to me. I'm teaching you because you're the closest I've ever had to a little brother. She nodded sharply, ignoring Naruto's incredulous look. 2. If you're going to learn my fighting style, you need to understand that it is developed for self-defense only, and is meant to really hurt others. Not to kill, but to hurt. Badly. Her eyes tightened. Which means if I catch you using this against someone that isn't attacking you first, I will stop teaching you immediately. Naruto nodded, looking down. I understand. Rei nodded. Good. 3. Her eyes softened. I want you to be careful, hero. She said softly. You see that stone over there? She pointed to the blue memorial stone standing innocently about 10 yards away. There's a long list of heroes carved out in that stone. But they all have one thing in common, they all died. She ruffled Naruto's hair, taking in his wide eyes. Being a ninja is damn dangerous, so you have to promise me one last thing. Don't make me regret teaching you how to get in danger. Don't make me regret not disapproving your dream because you wanted to be a hero. Don't make me carve your name on that stone. Do you hear me, Naruto? She grabbed the boy by his shoulders, looking him in the eye. Don't you dare get yourself killed. It'll be the promise of a lifetime. Naruto nodded slowly, then beamed up at Rei. I promise, Nei-chan. Rei's eyes widened and she grabbed him in a fierce hug. Now you're never getting out of that promise. Stupid little Otuto, she murmured, setting him back and crossing her arms. A glint came in her eye. Now let's see how you punch. Sarutobi watched Rei school Naruto through a punch, teaching him proper balance and a stance almost similar to the academy's own taijutsu stance, only to coax him back into a normal stand after the punch was completed. When Iruka had reported Naruto to be missing from his classes that morning, Hiruzen had immediately taken a guess and pulled out his glass ball, switching the image to the boy's apartment just in time to see Naruto request to be taught by the girl. In his first observations of the girl, he'd been rather surprised to see how often she'd scowled at something Naruto said or did, even smirking a bit when he was in distress from something, usually self-inflicted, only to scold the boy a moment later. If she hadn't made Naruto promise not to die as a ninja with such a fierce look in her eyes, Sarutobi might have thought her to be like most other civilians. It was a foolish hope, one that all civilians that were close to ninjas tried to cling on to. Judging by the sad look in Rei's eyes when he'd promised, she knew that too. Many shinobi died before they reached 20, the death rate among Chunin being the highest, qualified for more dangerous C ranks and B ranks, and 2 with their status to acknowledge their limits. Asking a ninja to not die was like asking the nations for world peace. It, to be frank, was not going to happen. But on the basis that the girl seemed to care dearly for the boy, it was easier to see the affection when she would scowl, and the underlining worry when she'd scold fiercely. Even now, as Rei whopped Naruto on the back of the head for a fairly stupid question, something about asking Rei if he could pick up the attacker and toss him to the ground, Sarutobi could see a fond grin on the boy's face when she continued to scold. So that was it then, there was no removing her from his influence. She was still suspicious, but for now would only have to be marked as a potential threat and watched. The same category as Naruto. Besides, what harm could come from one friend in the world? Sarutobi rubbed his face wearily at the naive thought a moment later. Enough trouble to destroy Konoha itself. Wakey wakey, eggs and bakey. Unlike the first time Rei had done so, over a year ago, Naruto immediately shot out of bed at the call. Just like last time, he had a losing match with his sheets, rolling all over the floor before pouting up at the girl. Rei only smirked back. Breakfast, hero, she said, jabbing a thumb to the table. In an instant all annoyance was forgotten for the food sitting on the table. Rei watched him eat, and nearly choke, in something akin to bemusement. He'd certainly grown up from the starving 8-year-old he'd once been in the past years, now quickly filling into the role of hyperactive ninja he was to be known for. He didn't seem to be at quite the same level of obnoxiousness he was known for in the manga at 10 years old, but it would probably come later. Maybe starting today, when he'd fail his first genin test. Nay-chan. Ray med and looked at Naruto, who'd finished his breakfast and was now looking at her with wide eyes. Do you think I'll pass the exams today? Ray barely held back a grimace. No, he couldn't pass, because he needed to graduate in 2 years' time, not now. He needed to be placed on Team 7 with the perverted Junin, the fangirl and the emo. He was not going to pass, and now he was asking Ray with those damn eyes for a lie. Ray wondered where her resolve to get a dog had gone. She promptly renewed it. I think it all depends on whether you're ready to be a ninja or not, Ray said finally. You're the youngest in your class, right? Naruto nodded eagerly. I'm not going to lie, hero. I really want you to be with other kids your age. But I don't have a doubt that you have the potential to surpass every Hokage in history. She said with an air of finality. It was technically the truth, without telling him that he would be definitely able to pass. Naruto beamed at her. I'll surpass every Hokage there ever was, he declared, even the Yondaime himself. Believe it. Ray merely gestured at the clock, watching him begin to hyperventilate with a hint of a smirk on her face. I think if I weren't here, you'd be late to everything, hero. Ray-chan. Naruto slumped over as he watched the other graduates walk out of the academy, shiny new headbands on their foreheads. He'd tried hard, really. All his last-minute work on the henge technique had finally paid off when he transformed into a perfect copy of the Hokage, but his bunshin fell flat. Literally. Oi, Naruto. Naruto looked up from the swing he was sitting on dejectedly, unable to go to the ramen stand with the news that he'd failed his exam to his friend. Iruka smiled kindly at him, a far cry from how he'd been in class. You okay? Naruto shook his head. I really wanted to pass, Iruka-sensei. He muttered. I worked really hard on the henge and everything. But every time I try the bunshin. Iruka watched the boy mope with a sigh before shrugging. Come on then, you like ramen? Naruto looked up so quickly that Iruka might have thought his head would fly off. Do I like ramen? He repeated incredulously. I love ramen. Ramen is the greatest thing in the world. And Ichiraku's ramen stand is my favorite place in the entire world. Iruka chuckled. Then how about I treat you to a bowl or two? Naruto grinned and slid off the swing. You better be prepared, Iruka-sensei. I can eat a whole lot more than that. The two walked over to Ichiraku's, though Iruka noticed how Naruto seemed more reluctant as they walked along. He shrugged. He probably wasn't looking forward to telling Ray about his failure. I'm sure your friend will understand, he said gently. You are 2 years younger than the other students, after all. Naruto looked up at Iruka incredulously before shaking his head. I know she'll understand, I just don't get what she told me this morning, he said, scowling slightly. She said that I'll be a ninja when I'm ready, but I don't know when I'll be ready for that. Iruka hummed as he thought about potential answers. Many people had different ideas about what being a ninja meant, so he could only answer. Then I suppose you'll have to ask. Naruto. Naruto's head whipped up at the call, racing the remaining distance to the ramen stand. Ray stood there with a worried look on her face. Iruka decided she had seen his lack of a headband. How'd it go? Naruto flinched, looking down. I couldn't do it, he mumbled. Ray sighed. That's okay, Naruto. Now you'll have a whole year to master what you learned this year, right? She said lightly. Come on, have some ramen. Naruto nodded, sitting on the stool and digging in as Ray placed a bowl in front of him. Naruto looked up at Ray. So what did you mean this morning? He asked. Ray shrugged. Depends on what you're talking about. Naruto pouted. When do you think I'll be ready to be a ninja? He demanded. Ray smirked and ruffled his hair. When you know what it means to be strong, she said lightly, winking at him. Iruka chuckled as Naruto pouted even harder, but then asked. Do you know what it means? Ray only turned away with a sigh. That's something you have to figure out on your own, hero. She said. If I told you, then you probably wouldn't really understand. Naruto scowled. But I'll still surpass every Hokage in history, he declared, pointing at Ray dramatically. Ray ruffled his hair with a rare smile. I don't doubt it for a minute. Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto cringed when Iruka called his name in the middle of class, immediately putting on what Ray called his puppy eyes. Yes, Iruka-sensei? In response, Iruka held up a purple paint-coated arm, pointing at him accusingly. What the hell did you do to the teacher's lounge? He yelled, a vein threatening to burst from his forehead. Naruto shrugged. It wasn't me? He almost asked. Iruka twitched. I wouldn't even consider that, but you left this. Iruka held up a small toolbox, orange in color and with the words, Uzumaki Naruto, written in pen on the top. Naruto's eyes widened. I forgot my kit, he yelped, running over and grabbing it from Iruka. He grinned up at the flabbergasted man. Thanks Iruka-sensei. I really owe you one. Iruka growled. Naruto. Naruto scowled as he scrubbed the paint off the walls of the teacher's lounge under the watchful eye of the still colorful Iruka. Iruka-sensei, do I really have to? Yes, but could I? No. How about? Hell no. Naruto scowled and rubbed the back of his ear. You didn't even hear what I was going to say. He muttered. I can tell it was a stupid idea already. Iruka simply said. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. Naruto, why the hell have you been doing so many pranks lately? He demanded. What would Rei-san say? Naruto's answer was a foxy gin and a shameless. The kit was her birthday present to me. She said the chalkboard incident wasn't creative enough. Iruka twitched. 10 paint-filled balloons tied to the walls with rubber bands, all flung towards the door when someone would open it. Iruka shook his head slowly while Rei only smirked. If only he would put such dedication into his school. He created the most inventive trap I've ever seen. And from a room with only one door and no windows. Rei placed the bowl of ramen in front of Iruka, still smirking. You'd think that ninja would be impossible to prank. She said lightly. Aren't you all trained to be on your guard from traps? Iruka blushed. I wasn't expecting a trap in the teacher's lounge. Rei raised an eyebrow. And this is what, the 10th time he's gotten you this year? She asked, mirth coating every word. Iruka scowled as he ate his ramen. 12th, he muttered. I'm just saying, the boy's got a gift. Who am I to discourage that kind of thing? She replied, shrugging. Besides, imagine if he'd taken those pranks and filled them with death traps instead. Say, taken the itching powder and instead put in poison? Iruka shuddered. He'd been covered in head to toe with that stuff for 3 days. He could still feel phantom itches from time to time. It definitely has potential, Iruka said finally, scratching one of said phantom itches. But why me? Rei shrugged. You're his favorite teacher, obviously. She said. The only reason he doesn't prank me is because I'm in charge of his ramen intake. Iruka suddenly blinked as he realized something. Where is Naruto anyway? He's usually here around this time. He asked. Probably working on an exercise I gave him. Rei said. I call it punishment, but he really enjoys training for some insane reason. Iruka blinked. You're teaching him something? He asked. Just an old martial art. It might conflict with his taijutsu though. Iruka med. Well, he's been developing these odd habits when the students spar. He said thoughtfully. When one of the students tried to punch him, he did this odd deflection and seemed to almost do something to the boy's arm before catching himself. Rei nodded. Probably an arm-breaking technique. I forbid him from using the style in school, though. It's not meant to be used against kids his level. Iruka blinked. Really? What's it for, then? He asked. Self-defense. Mostly against someone he doesn't have a snowball's chance in defeating. Rei-chan. Rei blinked as Naruto raced up to the ramen stand, waving at Rei dramatically. Speak of the devil. Oi, Rei-chan. Naruto bounded up and jumped onto a stool, grinning broadly with his face flushed with sweat. I did it. I really did it. I managed to run around the park 10 times without stopping. Rei stared incomprehensibly. Naruto. She said slowly. I told you to run around the park 5 times. With breaks in between. Naruto shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, there's this one kid at school who said that he does it 20 times, so I thought I might try doing it even more. He said with a grin. But hey, Kyo-san stopped by while I was near your apartment and told me to give you this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small red book, handing it to her. Iruka blinked owlishly. Rei-san, isn't that one of those Icha books? He said incredulously. Rei flushed and shoved the book in her pocket. Maybe. Naruto nodded at his question. She said it was called Icha Violence. Rei-chan's a big fan of the series. She reads the book all the time, MMPH. Rei slapped a hand over Naruto's mouth, still morbidly red in the face. Thank you, Naruto, she muttered. Iruka gave her an odd look but shrugged and paid for the meal. Well, I need to go anyway. Thank you Rei-san. See you in class, Naruto. He nodded at them and walked away. Naruto removed Rei's hand and scowled at her. Rei-chan, why do you always hide the fact that you read those books, anyway? he asked. Oji-san does the same thing. What's a pervert, anyway? Rei pinched the bridge of her nose, squeezing her eyes shut. That, she finally said, is a discussion I never, ever want to have. Fail. But Iruka-sensei. No. Naruto, your clone is half dead. But, next. Naruto slumped and walked slowly from the room, kicking the door as he left. What would he say to Rei now? He'd been able to blow off his last failure as a fluke, but twice in a row? It was like the universe was trying to tell him something. Imagine his surprise when Rei only blinked and replied, "Then I guess you don't know what makes someone strong." Naruto scowled. But Rei-chan, I worked really hard this year too. Rei raised an eyebrow as she set Naruto's customary bowl of ramen in front of him. So is that what you think makes someone strong then? Hard work only? Naruto hmmphed as he dug into his ramen, thinking hard. Yes? He asked hesitantly. Rei shook her head. It certainly helps, but it isn't quite what gives you strength when you need to fight. She said. Then what is it? Naruto demanded. Rei shook her head. Like I said, hero. It's something you have to figure out on your own. But you were strong when you protected me. Naruto yelled. Rei smirked. That's because I had the secret. She said lightly, ruffling his hair. Now all you need to do is find it yourself. But I think you're pretty close already. If you don't pass this year, I'll wear a pink dress for a whole year. Naruto could only stare wide-eyed at her. Really? Naruto, when have I ever gone back on my word? Rei asked. Naruto considered this for a while, then shrugged. Never, I guess. Don't worry though. He grinned. I'll make sure you won't have to do that. I'll pass this year without a doubt, and I'll be the greatest Hokage in the world. Believe it. Rei smiled slightly. That's good. But I want you to do something this year, hero. She said sternly. Anything. I want you to make friends. Naruto blinked owlishly at Rei. Friends? Rei rubbed her ear. Yes, Naruto. Friends. I know you had trouble with that the past 2 years, but now you're the same age as everyone else. She said firmly. You are going to make friends this year. Naruto looked at her appraising ly, then sighed. Fine. He scowled over another bowl of ramen, then looked up suddenly with a grin that Rei decided she did not like. By the way, Nate-chan, I asked Oji-san what a pervert was. He grinned even wider when Rei choked, eyes wide. Ayan? He told me. Suddenly Naruto blushed, looking away. He gave me the talk. Rei suddenly had a vivid image of the old Hokage, the most powerful ninja in Konoha, sitting in his office, Naruto on his knees, blushing as he told the blonde all about the birds and the bees. She burst into laughter. Naruto sat in the corner of the classroom, scowling as he looked over the class. He rubbed the back of his ear as he went over his mental review of his classmates. He'd been observing them the first 3 weeks into the new year, and he'd narrowed down his classmates to quite a few that stuck out in his mind. There was Choji. The boy seemed to like chips as much as Naruto liked ramen, not to mention how friendly he seemed to be around the other students. Shikamaru was another interesting kid, but he slept even more than Naruto in class and always seemed to find something wrong with something. Kiba seemed rather fun, and his nin dog was pretty cool. Naruto decided he'd judge Kiba a bit further after he saw his reaction to one of his legendary pranks. Shino seemed kind of creepy, but Naruto had been hanging around Rei long enough to see he seemed almost shy instead of always scowling like most people would assume. Then there was Sasuke. Naruto med at the thought, sneaking a glance to said raven-haired boy that was glaring out a window. At first he tried to talk to the boy, seeing something in him that he recognized as some sort of need for acknowledgement he'd known most of his life. But Sasuke's kind of dark personality was a complete 180 from the kind he'd always associated with Rei, even if she scowled almost as much as the Uchiha and almost had the same smirk. He just seemed more cold. So Naruto instead moved on. There was Ino, but she always got all weird around Sasuke and seemed to scare a lot of boys around her. And Hinata. Naruto was a bit skeptic though. The pale-eyed girl had taken one look at Naruto that first day and looked away immediately, turning an odd shade of red. She hadn't really looked angry though, more embarrassed? A possibility then, if he could get her to talk to him. Or there was Sakura. Naruto glanced at the pink-haired girl from the corner of his eye. She was shy too, and always had her pink hair in her face and looked away when someone talked to her. She seemed pretty smart though. She was always answering the right thing when Iruka asked a question and went through their quizzes faster than anyone else. He was still trying to find that promised friend. Ray had said that making friends was more a matter of finding someone that needed you as much as you needed them, but as far as Naruto was concerned, he simply needed the company of any generally nice person. He remembered asking what other people would need when they'd had everything else in the world that he didn't. Ray's eyes had softened and she'd ruffled his hair slowly. You know, I once had a family. Naruto had gone completely stiff at her words. He hadn't really asked much about where Ray had come from before he met her in the alley that night, years ago. In return, she'd never asked why the orphanage kicked him out or even why the people seemed to hate him. Truth be told, Naruto wasn't sure that Ray even knew in the first place. Maybe that was why she'd never hated him. There was one time on Ray's 19th birthday when he'd asked why she didn't have that many friends in Konoha, and she'd shrugged and said she was from somewhere far away. It was the whole thing, hero. A mom, a dad, a house in a nice city. Ray had said, eyes far off as her hand rested on Naruto's head. It was a really nice place too. Bigger than Konoha, even. Naruto stared at her with round eyes. A whole family? Bigger than Konoha? Whole lot more stuff, too. And you know what? I loved that place. I loved that life. It was peaceful and really carefree. But then she'd smirked down at Naruto. And then I wind up in an alley of a city I didn't live in with nothing but the clothes on my back and a little puppy that made sure I wasn't lonely. You asked what people could need from you? Naruto nodded with wide eyes. It sounded like Ray had been in heaven before she'd come to Konoha. And then she'd gone down to him, the thing that the entire village seemed to hate? I think we all need a little guy in our lives that decides that even if he had nothing himself, he still wants to give everything he's got. Ray smirked down at the gaping Naruto. I think we all need a hero. Naruto grinned before slowly settling into a thinking pose. So how does that help me make friends? Ray's face then dwindled into something sheepish for all of 3 seconds before she scowled. You killed a nice speech, Naruto. She growled. I guess a good friend is just someone that you can go camping with in the middle of the big, bad woods with and sleep feeling that you'll survive until morning. Ya know, someone to trust with your life. She then grinned sheepishly, very out of place for her. I'm not making much sense, am I? Not really, Nei-chan. Why would I go camp in the woods? Is it for a mission? Sure. Then I won't sleep at all. I'd finish the mission before lunch and get back for ramen. Believe it. Oh, Naruto. Naruto? Naruto blinked himself out of his thoughts as he realized someone was talking to him and that the students had already filed back into the classroom. He blinked up at Iruka. Iruka looked somewhat worried. You okay? Naruto grinned, flashing a thumbs up. Don't worry, Iruka-sensei. I'm definitely going to pass this year. Believe it. His voice dropped into a whisper as his eyes grew wide. Ray-chan said if I don't pass this year, she'll wear a pink dress for a whole year. And she's never gone back on her word. Iruka briefly pictured the scowling girl that worked at the ramen stand in pink and lace before shuddering. You'd definitely better pass then, he said, half joking and half serious. I don't want to think of what she'd do to people that laughed at her then. She'd probably kick them all in the… Naruto. What? She did it before to this one guy. Really, really hard, too. What? Naruto panted heavily as he stepped in closer, watching his attacker throw a jab at his nose. He brought up an arm and moved the attacking fist to the side, his other arm coming up for an open palm to the attacker's throat. When they gagged and paused, he kicked the side of their knee, bringing his own knee up and directly into their falling face. He then flashed a peace sign at her. Did it? Ray absent-mindedly rubbed her face and throat as she stood, though she still smirked. Naruto hadn't been going hard enough to actually harm her like he could have, something she really appreciated. Not bad, Otuto. She said finally. You almost let down your guard when you kicked me though. If I'd been faster, I would have probably gone for your throat. Naruto pouted. You always go for the throat though. He whined, unconsciously holding his own neck. Why? Ray shrugged, tapping the odd scar on her neck. It's the most vulnerable part of the body. She explained. One hit to it, armed or unarmed, can easily get you killed. Naruto HMMPHED. But you don't let us spar with kunai. He exclaimed. Or shuriken. Or anything. I don't know how to use any of that stuff, hero. Ray scowled. Martial arts is meant for when you have nothing but your own body. But, she peered at Naruto appraising Ly. Using most of the moves I taught you with a kunai in your hand. Yes, those would work. Naruto grinned. So can we try using kunai then? Ray looked at him incredulously. Hell no, she exclaimed. I'm not suicidal, but I think it might be interesting to learn with a practice stick. I actually did learn some basics of using daggers with the style. Ray waved off his expression. But later. For now I want to work on your moves. You're still somewhat sloppy. I just keep forgetting which way to move. Naruto growled. It's hard because I'm learning Academy Taijutsu too. Ray med. That's a problem, she finally said. Because you suck at Taijutsu more than this. You're actually really good at this, she reassured him. But if there's one thing I've learned, you can always be better. I'm not even a master at it myself. Naruto grinned. Then I'll just train harder. He exclaimed. I'll master it no problem. And I won't go back on my word. Believe it. Ray suddenly paused as a movement caught the corner of her eye. Naruto, she said quietly, not looking at the tree where a dark-haired figure seemed to be hiding. Did anyone follow you from the academy? She whispered. Naruto blinked and shook his head. Not that I know of. He said, shrugging. Why? Ray pointed to the tree, where the figure gasped and hid behind it. Oh, hey, you, Naruto yelled to the tree. Get out here. Spying on people is rude, you know. Ray's sweat dropped. Naruto still never ceased to amaze her sometimes. Sorry. Ray blinked as a tiny girl about Naruto's age timidly stepped out from behind the tree, head down in shame and fingers pressed together nervously. I was just curious. She said quietly. Ray swore in her head as she realized that it took her at least a minute of staring before she recognized the girl as Hyuga Hinata. Her memory was starting to fail. I know you, Naruto exclaimed, pointing to her. You're that girl that always turns red when I talk to you. He said, cocking his head to the side. Are you sick or something? Naruto. Ray whopped the back of Naruto's head. She then raised an eyebrow at the girl. Well, it's okay, come here. At least introduce yourself. The girl eeped quietly but walked forward, looking up and meeting Ray's eyes, who tried not to fidget as milky eyes stared at her. My name's Hyuga Hinata. She said quietly. Naruto blinked and grinned. I'm Uzumaki Naruto, he said, pointing to himself. He then pointed to Ray. And that's Ray-chan. She's kind of scary at first, but she's really nice once you know her. Ray whopped his head again. Kuroda Ray, she said, trying to remove the scowl from her face at Naruto's words. She wasn't that scary, damn it. Nice to meet you. Hinata only looked away from Naruto with a blush, making Ray's eyebrows raise and a smirk slowly form. She hid it with a cough. So, Hinata. Ray glanced sideways at Naruto. How long have you been there? Hinata flushed. About half an hour. Ray med. They'd been sparring for at least 40 minutes. It was a rather secluded section of the park that they were always in, so they usually didn't have visitors. Ray only said that it was private lessons anyway. Hey Ray-chan, can Hinata stay for a while? Naruto suddenly asked, turning from where he'd been staring curiously at Hinata. I know it's private lessons, but Hinata's really good at taijutsu at the academy. She's probably as good as Sasuke even. Ray raised an eyebrow at the very red Hinata. Is that so? Ray murmured. That's fine, then. We've only got about half an hour left, anyway. Care to join us, Hinata? Hinata blushed and nodded. Naruto grinned. Great, then we can all go get ramen after. Do you like ramen, Hinata? Naruto decided he'd found a good friend when she blushed and nodded. Thank you, Ray-san. Ray shrugged as she set the bowl in front of Hinata, handing her a pair of chopsticks. It's no problem, she only said. Naruto, sitting beside Hinata, grinned as he set down his third bowl. So Hinata, he said, pushing his bowl towards Ray. What were you doing at the park anyway? Not many people go to where we were. Hinata blushed lightly at the attention. I was taking a walk. I was going to be alone, but. Her blush deepened. Then I heard you training and I started to watch. Ray filled Naruto's bowl and pushed it back towards the boy. Was all she said. Hinata ducked her head. I am sorry for spying but. No, that's fine. Ray cut her off, waving a hand. The stuttering was really making any conversation difficult. Oh well, she supposed she could live with it for Naruto. Naruto's an interesting kid, isn't he? I sometimes find myself staring at him myself and wondering what the hell could possibly be going on in that thick skull. Nate-chan. Yes, Naruto? Ray blinked innocently at Naruto before smirking. Naruto scowled back, slamming a fist on the counter. Hinata was probably amazed with my awesome martial arts. He declared, pointing at the timid girl dramatically. Isn't that right, Hinata? Hinata was slowly resembling a tomato. Aye, Hinata. Ray sighed. It's okay. Be calm. Take 3 deep breaths and nod your head slowly. Hinata slowly inhaled and exhaled, then bobbed her head up and down. Now answer Naruto's retarded question before he has a heart attack. Ray-chan. Hinata exhaled once more. I was curious about the taijutsu you were using. She looked up at Ray in wonder when she realized she'd only stuttered once. How? I used to be shy myself, Hinata. Ray said, an amused twitch at her lips. I know you might think I'm pretty scary now, but when I learned to fight I learned to be a bit more confident. The breaths and nodding thing was something I used to have to do before learning to punch someone in the gut. Hinata seemed a bit sick at the thought, but nodded again. I wish I could be more confident. She whispered. Father doesn't like it when I stutter. The older girl sighed. I think it's just you being shy. She said in reassurance. Lots of people start off as shy. Then there's those that decide that they're going to plunge right through whatever they think and feel. Simultaneously, the 2 girls turned to the blonde that was rapidly eating his 5th bowl. He blinked back owlishly. What? Hinata giggled while Ray shook her head. Anyway, you seem like you want to ask something. Ask away, Hinata. I'm not sure if I can always answer, but you'll never know unless you ask. Hinata pressed the tips of her fingers together shyly. I was wondering what kind of taijutsu you 2 were using. She said, ducking her head slightly. I haven't seen any other shinobi use it before. Ray's lips quirked. Hinata, I'm not a ninja. Hinata blinked, startled. I've never had any training in any ninja arts. But that taijutsu. Hinata, what's the definition of a taijutsu? Hinata blinked. It's a shish shinobi technique using the B body and P potentially chakra to dispatch the enemy. Ray nodded. And my martial arts are me using my body to neutralize an attacker. There's a big difference, she added when Hinata didn't seem to understand. For one, it's meant for people without too much strength at all. I've barely trained my body my entire life. For another, to neutralize an attacker means that I didn't pick the fight myself. It's terrible for actually attacking someone. Hinata seemed confused. Doesn't attack? Ray nodded. It's pure defense. Well, in the sense that someone can't attack you when you've broken their bones and internal organs. Naruto nodded eagerly. And kicked them in the... Naruto. Hinata was still perplexed. Then what? Ray sighed. What use is it for a ninja? She finished. Hinata seemed mortified as she ducked her head, blushing heavily. It's fine, it's a good question. It's actually a style that is meant for fighting someone you don't want to fight. It's for getting away. Hinata looked up, startled. But why would you run from an enemy? Hinata, Ray said gently. I told you, I'm not a ninja. I don't want to fight people. But I also don't want someone to come up to me and push me around like I'm completely helpless. It's a last resort and only to be used as necessary. It's not supposed to kill people, usually. She became unfocused for a moment before shaking her head. It's just you telling other people not to mess with you and that you aren't going down without a fight. Ray suddenly smirked. It's kind of like Naruto. Yeah, wait, what? Naruto blinked up at the dark-haired girl, who only waved him off. He shrugged. Whatever, but it's still really cool to learn. And now I don't have to worry about someone hurting my friends. He grinned, rubbing the back of his neck. 'Cause if anyone tries to, I can just get in front of them and kick their asses. Ray ruffled Naruto's hair proudly. Exactly, hero. Naruto stared at Ray in confusion for a second, before shrugging again and turning to Hinata. But I'm going to master it once I become Hokage. He said firmly. And I'll protect the entire village just like the 4th. He was the best Hokage out of all of them, and I'll surpass him too. Believe it. Hinata was now staring at Naruto with an odd look in her eye, and Ray rolled her eyes. Good grief. Naruto's stunned his first girl. Ray suddenly had a mental image of fighting off dozens of girls chasing after a 16-year-old Naruto. At least this one I approve of. Hinata then glanced at the clock and gasped. I'm late. she whimpered, stepping down from the stool. Naruto blinked then waved. "Well, see you tomorrow, Hinata-chan," he called. Hinata froze and looked at Naruto for a long moment, then slowly smiled. "SCUN Naruto-kun." She stuttered, then bowed to Rei and Naruto before turning and running down the street. Rei med after her retreating figure. "She's cute. I approve, Naruto-kun." Naruto didn't seem to understand, making the older girl smirk. "I'll bet you can't wait to meet your Hinata-chan at school tomorrow." Naruto looked at Rei for a long moment. "You're acting weird, Nei-chan," he finally said, narrowing his eyes. "Are you feeling okay?" Rei scowled, rubbing her ear. "You make teasing so hard sometimes, Naruto." She grumbled. "Fine, you'll have to deal with it yourself. If you end up with a harem, don't come crying to me." She growled, throwing her arms up and stalking away. Naruto blinked and followed after. "What's a harem?" Rei groaned. "Rei-chan, 6 bowls of ramen please." "Oh, nah, Naruto?" Rei looked up from the book she was reading with a bewildered look on her face. She would only bring out her red book around this time of day, when Tucci had gone on his lunch break. Turned out he didn't eat ramen as often as one with a ramen stand might, and there were virtually no customers. "Speaking of time, is school out early? And who are they?" Naruto scratched the back of his neck sheepishly as he waved a hand to the 3 boys, and dog, behind him. "This is Shikamaru." Shikamaru med and raised a brow at Rei. Choji waved his bag of chips in a friendly wave. "And Kiba." Kiba flashed a feral, yet adorable, grin as he pointed to the white lump on his head. "And this is Akamaru," he said, the puppy yipping in response. Rei looked them all over with a blank expression before shrugging. "Kuroda Rei," she said, nodding before turning to Naruto. "Now is class out early?" "Well." Naruto rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly while the other 3 tensed. "Iruka had to know her if she worked at Ichiraku's, right?" Naruto probably knew better than to tell her. "We skipped class," he chirped, sitting casually on a stool and motioning for the other 3 to join him. Instead they watched Rei sigh heavily. "Naruto, I'm very disappointed in you," she said. The 4 looked up with wide eyes. "You didn't even invite Hinata." "What?" The same thought ran through their minds. Shikamaru and Choji were really the only of the group to know each other. Naruto had seen them sneaking away from the grounds that afternoon and had followed, jumping and asking where they were going. Kiba had heard the 3 talking and exclaimed excitedly that if they were going to ditch, then by all means let him come. Then the 4 stood around awkwardly until Naruto suggested they go get ramen, a food he declared to be the greatest in the world. Choji seemed elated at the idea of food and Shikamaru simply shrugged. Then Kiba said, wouldn't the workers at the ramen stand rat them out? After all, they all knew Iruka-sensei was a regular at Ichiraku's. "Nah, Rei-chan's the only one at the stand around this time, and she won't care," Naruto had exclaimed. They hadn't really believed him, but now looking at the scowling girl they could only shake their heads. "I'm sorry," Naruto yelped, eyes wide. "But I didn't think Hinata-chan would have wanted to come." Rei only scowled harder, then relaxed with a sigh. "Just remember to ask her next time," she finally said, making the 3 students behind Naruto reel back in shock. "Next time?" Rei quirked an eyebrow at their expressions. "Well, of course you're going to do this again," she stated, rolling her eyes. "Only 2 months into the year and you ditch, then you expect me to believe that you'll simply stop?" Peeved, she brought out 6 bowls of ramen while they digested this. "I'm not stupid." Eventually the boys shrugged and began to make their way towards the ramen, only to blink as it was inhaled by Naruto in front of them. Naruto blinked at them. "What?" he asked around the last of the 6th bowl. "Did you guys want some too?" Naruto still didn't understand even as Rei rolled her eyes and sighed heavily, changing the subject. "So you're all at the academy?" Kiba nodded. "We're just ditching, 'cause Iruka-sensei got too boring again," he said in excitement. Shikamaru shrugged. "I'm just going along with it," he muttered. Rei med. "And you too?" she asked the last 2 boys. "Ramen," they chorused, both giving Rei a thumbs up. Her lips quirked. "Then I'd better start making a new pot," she said in amusement. "But only if you manage to finish it." "Rei-chan," Naruto said slowly, disbelief in his voice. "I can eat 3 pots of Ichiraku's ramen by myself. We can handle 1 measly pot." "Believe it." The rest of them just rolled their eyes. "I just don't get it, Rei." Iruka sighed and gently placed the chopsticks on the counter. He doesn't give up. Rei only shrugged as she wiped the bowl clean, placing it in the back and coming back to the man. Come on, Iruka, she said, you should have moved on from this by now. Even if Naruto doesn't pass this year, and he will, Rei silently added. You know he'll just bounce back up and do everything to make the village acknowledge him. He's been working so hard since the Hokage first told him he could be a ninja. Rei closed her eyes as images of Naruto yelling and punching a nearly broken tree, long past the sun setting, flashed through her mind. He's always trying to get that. Iruka growled silently. What I don't get is why. Why does he want attention from people that hate him for something he can't control? Rei sighed. I don't know, she said quietly. I once asked him, somewhere around his 11th birthday. We were cornered by at least 3 men and one of them managed to give Naruto a black eye before he snapped out of his trance. Rei still didn't forgive herself for thinking that it would have been safe to go out just because it was a few days before October 10th. Apparently some civilians got started early. She took care not to mention to Iruka how the black eye had faded before Naruto had even known it was there. I took him home and asked him why the hell he'd want attention from people who would attack innocent kids. He looked up at me with wide eyes and said, they just don't know that I'm innocent, Rei-chan. Rei mocked Naruto's high, excited voice almost perfectly, complete with a stupid grin that really seemed out of place on her. But once they see that I'm protecting them, they'll acknowledge me as the greatest hero that ever lived. Believe it, Rei's face dropped back into a scowl. And then what could I say? That this place is crawling with dumb-assed civilians and greater-than-thou ninja just waiting for him to slip up so they can slit his throat? Iruka coughed lightly, but he could see what Rei meant. There were times he wasn't sure who he could trust with even talking about how Naruto did in his classes, seeing how anything Naruto did was fueled to a fire that didn't want to die. It was really a good thing there was Rei. He wasn't sure what Naruto would do if the scowling girl wasn't there to pick him up in the midst of a mob of civilians. On Iruka's part he tried to keep Naruto away from certain ninja he knew weren't too well disposed towards the boy. It was rather funny, he'd always been more mild than most ninja, giving him an almost civilian-like quality in everyday life, while Rei had always been sharper than most civilians, seeming to always be out of place doing something as boring as serving ramen. Not that her scowling helped any. Almost like a ninja. I don't know, he muttered. He's just so happy all the damn time. Rei cocked her head to the side suddenly. What brought this all on, anyway? She suddenly asked. Did something happen? Iruka med. I had a talk with Mizuki today about Naruto. Iruka said slowly. Rei inwardly wondered why the name seemed to be really important, damn it. And he said some stuff. I'd personally always thought him to be somewhat neutral about Naruto, seeing how he doesn't usually show any open hostility. Not unless he's particularly upset about something. Usually? Rei rolled her eyes. Iruka-san, I found that if the words a person says in extreme emotion are a stark contrast from the usual, then you've got a two-face on your hands. Iruka scowled. It's not his fault, he's just. Iruka struggled for a way to defend his colleague, but then said man's words from earlier popped back in his mind and he let out a sigh. Never mind, I'm not sure myself, anyway. Why, what did he say? He said, Iruka seemed torn. That it'd be better for the village if the Kyuubi brat would just crawl off into the woods and died. Crack. Iruka blinked at the shattered porcelain while Rei's lip curled in a snarl, hands still clenched in what little of the bowl was left. That bastard. Rei snarled in English. Iruka stared even further when the tiniest amount of killing intent, not even a genin's size, but still more than any civilian, seemed to ooze out of the girl. If he so much as touches Naruto, I'll rip out his entrails and feed him his liver. God-damned ninja or not, she snapped, clenching her fists tightly. Rei had suddenly remembered who it was that led Naruto away into the woods and tried to kill him after telling him he was the Kyuubi's container. It was something crucial to Naruto's life, but something she suddenly wanted more than ever to prevent. She suddenly wondered when exactly she'd stopped thinking of the characters as characters and started calling them people. Rei shook her head. She'd think about that later, for now she'd fight off the odd urge to strangle something. Oh, Iruka had said something. What? She asked, reverting back to Japanese. He was now looking at her with calculating eyes. I'm not sure you can know what it was like to lose someone in the Kyuubi attack. He said gently, though oddly wary. Rei blinked. Was he asking something? I didn't live here at the time, she said honestly. So I guess I can't really know what Mizuki feels, she admitted grudgingly. I didn't really lose anyone because of a mountain-sized biju. Ray shuddered at the thought. I can't imagine what that'd be like. Then how the hell do you know about the Kyuubi? Iruka said suddenly, sitting up straight and looking at Ray. Naruto's condition is an S-class secret, especially from foreigners. Ray nearly went cross-eyed as she realized her mistake. Shit, I forgot about the secret part. Ray frantically searched her mind for an excuse before a light bulb went off. Well, the Kyuubi attack was 11 years ago, and Naruto's the village pariah. I just put 2 and 2 together, she said, fighting to keep her face straight. Great, lying to a ninja, one of the many things she swore she'd never do. Mainly because it was stupid. The thought made her scowl. Naruto's not the only one like that, you know. There's 8 other biju out there. How do you think they've dealt with them? Iruka stared at Ray for a moment longer before hmming and thought. So where are you from? He asked casually. I've always noticed you've had a strange accent, if you don't mind me saying. And I've never heard that language before. Ray shrugged. She'd still never gotten out of her accent. Maybe she'd have it forever. At least as long as she was stuck here. Ray had given up on going home years ago, though. A country far away from here. Ray murmured, looking somewhere past Iruka. Iruka blinked. What was it called? Japan. Ray finally said truthfully. It's not like they'd find it, anyway. But I was originally from America. They speak a different language there. Iruka blinked. I've never heard of that country. He said, but then narrowed his eyes. Are you sure you aren't? I'd appreciate you not accusing me, Iruka-san, over something you just aren't informed about. Ray snapped. I may not tell people every little thing about me, but I have my reasons. Iruka just stared at Ray unblinkingly, making her rub the back of her ear then sigh heavily, pressing a hand to her temple. Sorry, Iruka, I'm just not feeling that great tonight. She offered a weak smile, then sighed again. I think I'm gonna take off early, Tucci-san. Ray called, reaching a hand in her pocket and yanking out Icha violence. She needed a distraction from that godforsaken angst that she almost spilled on poor Iruka, and for once she didn't care who saw her with the smut. Damn addicting smut. Iruka only stared after her retreating figure. Ah, Iruka. The Hokage greeted the scarred teacher with a friendly nod behind his desk. Do you have something to report? Iruka sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Yes sir. Ray-san told me where she's from. That made the Hokage straighten up in his seat. He'd asked Iruka, as a regular patron to Ichiraku's, to make occasional reports on the girl, though only saying that it was unknown where she was from and making it seem like a passing interest. Falcon, initially disturbed by his lack of intel on the girl, had been searching for any information on the girl's past with the air of a man that had never before been thwarted in such a manner. Even root members had a file, though usually so well hidden that it presented quite a challenge. Even then, it couldn't quite be linked to Danzo. Kuroda Ray had presented quite a problem these past years. A girl, one with absolutely no background as far as they could find in the 5 nations, had appeared and became the absolute figure in the village Jinchuriki's life. Technically speaking, a Jinchuriki was eventually the most powerful shinobi in the entire village. A position in his life like Ray's, entirely influential and with no small amount of respect, made her virtually untouchable. And if Naruto became Hokage like he strived for nowadays, then she'd initially have the entire fire country wrapped around her little finger. It was possible she was simply the nice, yet grumpy, girl that Naruto believed her to be, but with nothing but shadows around her it was not something he could drop. Nor something he could quite pursue without a real cause rather than simple suspicions. Did she mention a country then? The Hokage asked, rubbing his beard thoughtfully. Again, he thought he was getting too old for this. Iruka hesitated. Yes, sir, but I've never heard of it. She called it Japan. And then she mentioned being from another country originally called America. Sarutobi raised his eyebrows. He'd never heard of those either. Was she lying then? I thought so at first, but... Iruka paused. Then she spoke in an entirely different language, and I do believe she was swearing. He added in amusement. The old man's brows raised his hairline. A different language? There was only one spoken language throughout all the nations, and as far as he, the professor, knew, there were very, very few other languages around. And those were old ones used for ancient rites, though never really spoken in everyday use. But if that accent was anything to go by, it was her first language. Which meant that she had been around other people that spoke the same language. Which meant that it was entirely possible that she was from a country that no one had ever heard of. Which would make any background information absolutely impossible. The Sanddame was now seriously considering retirement. That's all for now. If you enjoyed, then please like, share and do comments.